Standing by.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Complete.
Konnichigen, ohayo gozaimasu, is your favorite superstar maniac, the multi-dimensional Tajigen Khaiden, a sentient star cluster and many cosmic minds combined in VTuber, the singer form. You can already tell maybe I have a sort of voice I'm going for the reading. I don't know, I feel like I gotta be quiet even for the intro. Well, quiet is not the word, like, I gotta be quiet. I say as if I'm like making a racket for the entire neighborhood. Well, sometimes it feels like I am, but no. Like, I'm in a more quiety, yeah, ASMR voice. It's been a lovely week, Tajigen. It's been a lovely week. We've done amazing things in Balatro FF14 Legend CA. Like, Balatro had a nice win, you know, in blue stake difficulty. FF14, 10 hours, even longer than the one where we finished the MSQ. It's just the either current quest Insanity and the job quests, of course, but it was mostly the either current quest Insanity. Actually, the job quests themselves were about 3 hours of length, like doing all of them. You know, with some yapping in the middle and all that, but like each of them is gonna take a little while. Like, they gotta make it worth your while. Really give you a lot with each of them. There's no combat in any of them, right? I think there wasn't. Because it's like the last one, it's just the one. It's optional. Level 80. But like, yeah, like they're really gonna give you a lot right there. Really make it worth it that you went all the way to get that one after getting the role quest and all that. And even a bit of a connection to them. Legend CA yesterday, Story Saturday. Also, in case you didn't see me say it in the chat on Twitch or also in the pinned comment, sorry about the abrupt end yesterday. I say sorry, but it wasn't my fault. It was a power outage, and I was actually about to end the stream. Just a few minutes, I was gonna say, hey, okay, this is we'll wrap it up, and then I was gonna yap at the end and all that. Hopefully that doesn't happen today, of course, because also it did happen again later after the stream, and that one was longer. It was over 10 minutes long. Because it was only a few minutes, but a few minutes too many, and I didn't want the VOD to get split again, yet another split VOD. Like, oh my god, no. Like, we already had, for a different reason entirely, the VOD gets split for the FF14 stream. At least each part includes a lot in it. Would have been kinda a neat way to split it had it happened, like, we finished the job quest and then the other one is the either current stuff. Would have been such a neat way to do it. That's not how it went down. Last time First Man Chapter 12 onwards is what we aim to do today, though. Let me fetch my notes about... Let me fetch my notes for Last and First Man for the summaries. I'm gonna try to be more brief about them. But just to summarize a little bit of chapters 1 through 8. The First Man, which is us, you, I don't know. I'm a sentence star cluster in human age form. I'm not you. I'm not really, but yeah. From First World War, it happens there. Many wars happen. A world state gets formed. It's a utopic state, except that and in the inside, it's really not. There's a lot of issues. There's a lot of silly things going on there. And eventually, it's a society that collapses. Cannibalism, riots, destruction. A plague that was used in wars before, now used for this. It all goes down. Eventually another civilization happens, then that one collapses even worse. Barely does humanity survive. Eventually evolution happens. The second man, the second humanity. It's humanity, but they had to evolve. We had to evolve, they had to evolve. There's conflict with like subhumans that instead of evolving into second man, sub-evolved, and they were subjugated by monkeys eventually. The second men almost get wiped out by conflict with them. But then eventually the sub-men rise up against the monkeys, and the sub-men eventually die as well, onto the second man and all that. All of that happens. The second man eventually They have rises and falls as well. Societies like collapsing and all that. Eventually, they do develop a nice society that is an actual better utopia. And they start thinking, okay, we're going to evolve humanity, but now, you know, genetically manipulating it ourselves so it can be done well. However, Martians invade. Big Martian cloud. Big Martian cloud things. Cloud that can kind of become jelly, things like that. They do not understand that humans are sentient, not really. They kind of start understanding it. They have a group mind. Each individual is able to join to become a bigger mind. But the thing is, the mind is actually not bigger. It's bigger in mass, but not actually bigger in mental power and capacity. It is not greater than the sum of its parts. Super minds like that are actually very important in Stapledon's work. Super minds that actually are greater than that. And that are not hive minds. They are not a lesser thing like that. They do not make each member of their mind lesser because they become part of a larger mind. That's the important thing to point out. But eventually, the Martians get wiped out by the second man after all being figured out. Sadly, the Martians just don't understand it. They all die. Both on the ones on Earth and the ones on Mars. It reaches all the way there. Yes. The second man do eventually like almost die to the whole like aftermath of the plague and other things. The second men just were not doing well anymore mentally. They get into a big racial depression. Millions of years it goes this way. Then, well, yeah, let's talk about this now because this is like this is really the summary of like those chapters there. Let me see. Where is the summary I had for this? But yeah, that's the way it went down. 300,000 years the war lasted between Second Men and Martians, basically. Emerging 30 million years after the fall of the Second Men, the Third Men evolved on an island continent in the North Atlantic. They are short, slight beings with six-finger hands, cat-like muscles, and immense mobile bat-like ears. Their ears have a lot going on. They go through a lot, and I mean a lot of cultures that rise and fall. And by cultures, I don't mean like, oh, the collapse of the Bronze Age, or, well, I mean, that was kind of significant too. Or I mean, no, the collapse of the Bronze Age actually is kind of a comparison. I don't mean, when we say the rise and fall of these cultures or world states, I don't mean something like the Roman Empire. No. I mean apocalypse, like knowledge of the fact that humanity existed before and had a civilization that thrived is lost, and it starts again from primitive times, basically, very primitive times, prehistory-like times. Every single time this happens. And it happens over and over. Even more so with the Third Man, who basically have ADHD. Epoch racial ADHD. Because sometimes they're obsessed with one thing, and that's what the culture obsesses with, sometimes not. There's a holy empire of music, for example. There's a musical Jesus, basically, in that. Just like there was also for the First Man with like the Cult of Youth and the Kid and all of that. I talked about it before. Eventually, they obsess with one where it's all about biological manipulation, things like that. They split into two factions, one seeking to breed mediums to reach an unseen world, and then a secret group of governors aiming to produce a super brain. They actually... That group of secret governors, it actually goes beyond that. They create the Great Brains. These are the Fourth Man. The Great Brains, however, are the typical mistake of no emotions and all intelligence. And thus, well, they don't exactly become nice to the Third Man eventually. They subjugate / kill, genocide all the Third Men, all the Third Humanity, what was left of them at that time. But they keep, even through millions of years, or I don't know how many years, hundreds of thousands, many Third Men that, you know, they breed and they have new generations and all that. It's not the same like people the entire time, but they keep them as lab experiments, basically, to do their experiments. If it involves torture, pain, oh well, so be it. That's the experiment. Through those experiments also, and because the Fourth Brains eventually, the Fourth Man, the Giant Brains eventually understand that there is a lot they don't know by, first of all, not having emotions. Second of all, not having a humanoid body. They create the Fifth Man after a lot of trial and error, and the Fifth Men are an incredible creation and are actually done super well. They balance high intelligence with physical harmony and emotional depth. The Fifth Men were titanic, on average more than twice as tall as the First Man and significantly larger than the Second Man. Their legs were massive columns of masonry required to support their weight, yet their movements possessed a remarkable precision. They were hairless except for a ruddy brown skull cap with skin designed to maintain an even temperature in any climate. Their hands were unique, the sixth finger branching at the tip into two tiny fingers and a tip and a thumb for extremely minute manipulation. Like there. Their brain capacity was twice that of the second man, which already were more advanced than the first man. Their sensory equipment was enhanced with a wider range and finer discrimination, and their brains incorporated Martian units, which already were there in the third man, by the way, to provide telepathic faculties, though these were subordinated to prevent the individual from becoming a mere resonator of the herd. Again, we don't want it to be a hive mind situation in which the individual becomes lesser for becoming part of the hive mind. No. They reach maturity at age 200, remain in full vigor for approximately 3,000 years. At the first sign of serious decay, their hearts were designed to stop functioning immediately. Their digestive systems were improved by symbiotic microorganisms and the gut that made nutrition more efficient. And yeah, the temperament was also a perfect physiological equilibrium, a well-balanced temperament is what they had. They possessed an innate inclination toward higher activities, like altruism, art, religion, which early human species could only achieve through laborious discipline. And many things that are just unintelligible, impossible to understand for the first man, pretty much. Just like you would try to explain finances, law, things like that to an ape at the zoo. Like, well, no, a better example. To Homo habilis, to Homo erectus maybe, to a Neanderthal, or early European human. It's like, it would be like trying to explain that to them. Or in a more extreme example, this was one used by Stapledon himself in Last Man in London, like a cat in London trying to conceive the existence of finance or law or accounting, something like that, is what he said. Kind of like that. Or even trying to explain to them, it's a lot that can't be done. But yeah, then their culture, they had periods of conflict. There was the stuff with the fourth man. They overthrew them basically because the fourth man just could not understand it. They could not. And all of that gets lost as well, that knowledge, because they just descend into primitive barbarism like all the others. Potentially they had a rise and fall of civilizations. I remember that they did that. But at the very least, you know, the stuff with the fourth man, even that gets lost. All that knowledge gets lost to history because the fourth man figured out everything with the first man, the second man, the third man through archaeology. The third man never figured out entirely about the civilizations before them, I think, especially the earlier humans or the other humans. The second man, the first man. The second man did figure this out about the first man. And the Patagonian civilization, the second human civilization of the first man, did figure out the first one, which is this current one that becomes the world state. But anyway, they had great material abundance. Basically, they abolished all drudgery, like just by merely touching appropriate buttons, all could be done, like very, very like heavenly. Like the planet's population reached 10 billion, basically 10,000 million. They primarily reside in massive snow-capped pylons that dwarf the architecture in the previous age. They had a telepathic unity of sorts, but yeah. They allow the resolution of all conflicts through the operation linking of mind to mind to reach mutual understanding. Every individual was aware of every other person on the planet, to an extent, making the species a vast club or college. They had a place called the Wild Continent. To maintain a link with their primitive origins, they preserved one entire continent in its natural state. Individuals would spend a decade or some decades there, living as savages here and there, with primitive tools, hunting formidable new carnivora designed by the fifth man themselves to keep the experience dangerous and invigorating. This helps keep the mind a certain way. This kind of conflict helps the mind. Yes, sometimes they would die. Sometimes they would die and it would suck. But yeah. Really gotta mention the Wild Continent because a future species, a future humanity also is gonna have something similar, but also different, but like, yeah. I always keep picturing them wrestling a dinosaur, you know, when they say about new carnivora. Wrestling a dinosaur of sorts because of the size of the fifth man, you know? Something like that is what I'm thinking. But yeah, they master psychophysics, a science that merged the concepts of physics and psychology. Art was considered fundamental, basic to the cosmos. Like, you know, how breathing, how physics are, art is part of that, pretty much. It's like, when life forms, it's fundamental. Like, there's an art to it all, and, or at least this is my understanding of it. When life forms gain enough sentience, they gain enough sapience, I mean, art is gonna be inevitable. Even on the most Philistine, arguably. So that is just might as well consider it part of the cosmos. Most citizens not involved in organization or research were professional creative artists or handicraftsmen. Cultural movement was spiral. The race would fully cultivate certain aspects of existence, leave them fallow for millennia, and then return to them with new depth and significance. And we pretty much left it off there. Now, let me set up the stage so that we get the reading. I just need the little ambience I keep having in the background. That may sound like static noise a lot of the time. It kind of is, it kind of isn't. It's interplanetary arrivals, at least that's what it's called. It's like sci-fi ambience. Yeah. Let me reduce the volume of that. Okay. And here we are again. It's like, it gets very sci-fi like that, you know? It's a bit of like, you're kind of meant to be on a space station, something like that. Arguably, it might be more fitting for something like Star Maker. To an extent, it might be fitting here with some of the things that happen with the later humanities. But yeah, that's the summary. I guess I should have switched to this overlay already when we did the summary, but this works. That's where we left off last time in this. Now, let me check something here. Yeah. Yeah, and even within the Fifth Men themselves, I'm seeing this passage here that says the early Fifth Men were also, in a way, kind of biologically, in a minor way, biologically different than the later Fifth Men, and especially mentality, right? When you look back at a human 7,000 years ago, a Homo sapiens, they're not dumb necessarily, they just don't know better. A lot of, the entire race, the entire species does indeed help others know better eventually in the society and all that. Things like that. I can't find a good way to phrase it right now for some reason, but hopefully you know what I mean. It's just that they didn't know better, right? But to an extent, it also does play a part in intelligence and even biology to a certain extent. Changes like that, all of that. But yeah, as a map is like the mountainous land, or the picturized landscape, or indeed as the point and the circle are like the sphere, so and only so the earlier Fifth Men resembled the flower of the species. Such statements would be in a manner true of any period of steady cultural progress. But in the present instance, they have a peculiar significance, which I must now somehow contrive to suggest. Alright, we're actually going to begin right now. Give me a second, I'm gonna check a sound setting I have right here. Some other off-stream things. Okay. Let us actually continue here. Well, as the first man, I want to recenter myself. Hold on. I say, wait, yeah, finally, we're actually continuing, and I don't actually continue. Hold on. I never feel like I'm properly centered. I never will feel like I'm properly centered, maybe. Okay. Now we continue. Chapter 12 onwards. Ikuse. Chapter 12. 1. The Cult of Evanescence. The Fifth Men had not been endowed with that potential immortality which their makers themselves possessed. And from the fact that they were mortal and yet long-lived, their culture drew its chief brilliance and poignancy. Beings for whom the natural span was 3,000 years, and ultimately as much as 50,000, were peculiarly troubled by the prospect of death, and by the loss of those dear to them. The mere ephemeral kind of spirit that comes into being and then almost immediately ceases, before it has entered at all deeply into consciousness of itself, can face its end with a courage that is half unwitting. Even its smart in the loss of other beings with whom it has been intimate is but a vague and dreamlike suffering. For the ephemeral spirit has not time to grow fully awake or fully intimate with another, before it must lose its beloved and itself once more fade into unconsciousness. But with the long-lived yet not immortal Fifth Men, the case was different. Gathering to themselves experience of the cosmos, acquiring an ever more precise and vivid insight and appreciation, they knew that very soon all this wealth of the soul must cease to be. And in love, though they might be fully intimate not merely with one, but with very many persons, the death of one of these dear spirits seemed an irrevocable tragedy, an utter annihilation of the most resplendent kind of glory, an impoverishment of the cosmos forevermore. In their brief primitive phase, the fifth man, like so many other races, sought to console themselves by unreasoning faith in a life after death. They conceived, for instance, that at death terrestrial beings embarked upon a career continuous with earthly life, but far more ample, either in some remote planetary system or in some wholly distinct orb of space-time. But though such theories were never disproved in the primitive era, they gradually began to seem not merely improbable, but ignoble, for it came to be recognized that the resplendent glories of personality, even in that degree of beauty which now for the first time was attained, were not after all the extreme of glory. It was seen with pain, but also with exultation, that even love's demand that the beloved should have immortal life is a betrayal of man's paramount allegiance. And little by little, it became evident that those who use great gifts, and even genius, to establish the truth of the afterlife, or to seek contact with their beloved dead, suffer from a strange blindness and obtuseness of the spirit. Though the love which had misled them was itself a very lovely thing, yet they were misled. Like children searching for lost toys, they wandered. Like adolescents seeking to recapture delight in the things of childhood, they shunned those more difficult admirations which are proper to the grown mind. And so it became a constant aim of the fifth man to school themselves to admire chiefly, even in the very crisis of bereavement, not persons, but that great music of innumerable personal lives, which is the life of the race. And quite early in their career, they discovered an unexpected beauty in the very fact that the individual must die, so that, when they had actually come into possession of the means to make themselves immortal, they refrained, choosing rather merely to increase the lifespan of succeeding generations to 50,000 years. Such a period seemed to be demanded for the full exercise of human capacity, but immortality, they held, would lead to spiritual disaster. Now, as their science advanced, they saw that there had been a time, before the stars were formed, when there was no possible footing for minds in the cosmos, and that there would come a time when mentality would be driven out of existence. Earlier human species had not needed to trouble about mind's ultimate fate, but for the long-lived fifth man, the end, though remote, did not seem infinitely distant. The prospect distressed them. They had schooled themselves to live not for the individual, but for the race. And now the life of the race itself was seen to be a mere instant between the endless void of the past and the endless void of the future. Nothing within their ken was more worthy of admiration than the organized, progressive mentality of mankind, and the conviction that this most admired thing must soon cease filled many of their less ample minds with horror and indignation. But in time the fifth man, like the second man long before them, came to suspect that even in this tragic brevity of mind's course, there was a quality of beauty, more difficult than the familiar beauty, but also more exquisite. Even thus imprisoned in an instant, the spirit of man might yet plumb the whole extent of space, and also the whole past and the whole future. And so, from behind his prison bars, he might render the universe that intelligent worship which they felt it demanded of him. Better so, they said, than that he should fret himself with puny efforts to escape. He is dignified by his very weakness, and the cosmos by his very indifference to him. For eons they remained in this faith, and they schooled their hearts to acquiesce in it, saying, if it is so, it is best, and somehow we must learn to see that it is best. But what they meant by best was not what their predecessors would have meant. They did not, for instance, deceive themselves by pretending that after all they themselves actually preferred life to be evanescent. On the contrary, they continued to long that it might be otherwise. But having discovered, both behind the physical order and behind the desires of minds, a fundamental principle whose essence was aesthetic, they were faithful to the conviction that whatever was fact must somehow in the universal view be fitting, right, beautiful, integral to the form of the cosmos. And so they accepted it as right a state of affairs which in their own hearts they still felt grievously wrong. This conviction of the irrevocability of the past and of the evanescence of mind, induced in them a great tenderness for all beings that had lived and ceased. Deeming themselves to be near the crest of life's achievement, blessed also with longevity and philosophic detachment, they were often smitten with pity for those humbler, briefer, and less free spirits whose lot had fallen in the past. Moreover, themselves extremely complex, subtle, conscious, they conceived a generous admiration for all simple minds, for the early man, and for the beasts. Very strongly they condemned the action of their predecessors in destroying so many joyous and delectable creatures. Earnestly they sought to reconstruct in imagination all those beings that blind intellectualism had murdered. Earnestly they delved in the near and the remote past, so as to recover as much as possible of the history of life on the planet. With meticulous love they would figure out the life stories of extinct types, such as the brontosaurus, the hippopotamus, the chimpanzee, the Englishman, the American, as also of the still extant amoeba. And while they could not but relish the comicality of these remote beings, their amusement was the outgrowth of affectionate insight into simple natures, and was but the outburst of their recognition that the primitive is essentially tragic because blind. And so while they saw that the main work of man must have regard to the future, they felt that he owed also a duty toward the past. He must preserve it in his own mind, if not actually in life, at least in being. In the future lay glory, joy, brilliance of the spirit. The future needed service, not pity, not piety. But in the past lay darkness, confusion, waste, and all the cramped primitive minds, bewildered, torturing one another in their stupidity, yet one and all in some unique manner, beautiful. The reconstruction of the past, not merely as abstract history, but with the intimacy of the novel, thus became one of the main preoccupations of the fifth man. Many devoted themselves to this work, each individual specializing very minutely in some particular episode of human or animal history, and transmitting his work into the culture of the race. Thus increasingly the individual felt himself to be a single flicker between the teeming gulf of the nevermore and the boundless void of the not yet. Himself a member of a very noble and fortunate race, his zest in existence was tempered, deepened, by a sense of the presence, the ghostly presence, of the myriad less fortunate beings in the past. Sometimes, and especially in epochs when the contemporary world seemed most satisfactory and promising, this piety toward the primitive and the past became the dominant activity of the race, giving rise to alternating phases of rebellion against the tyrannical nature of the cosmos, and faith that in the universal view, after all, this horror must be right. In this latter mood it was held that the very irrevocability of the past dignified all past existence, and dignified the cosmos, as a work of tragic art is dignified by the irrevocability of disaster. It was this mood of acquiescence and faith which in the end became the characteristic attitude of the fifth man for many millions of years. But a bewildering discovery was in store for the fifth man, a discovery which was to change their whole attitude toward existence. Certain obscure biological facts began to make them suspect, on purely empirical grounds, that past events were not after all simply non-existent, that though no longer existent in the temporal manner, they had eternal existence in some other manner. The effect of this increasing suspicion about the past was that a once harmonious race was divided for a while into two parties. Those who insisted that the formal beauty of the universe demanded the tragic evanescence of all things, and those who determined to show that living minds could actually reach back into past events in all their pastness. The readers of this book are not in a position to realize the poignancy of the conflict which now threatened to wreck humanity. They cannot approach it from the point of view of a race whose culture had consisted of an age-long schooling in admiration of an ever-vanishing cosmos. To the orthodox, it seemed that the new view was iconoclastic, impertinent, vulgar. Their opponents, on the other hand, insisted that the matter must be decided dispassionately, according to the evidence. They were also able to point out that this devotion to evanescence was, after all, but the outcome of the conviction that the cosmos must be supremely noble. No one, it was said, really had direct vision of evanescence as in itself an excellence. So heartfelt was the dispute that the Orthodox party actually broke off all telepathic communication with the rebels, and even went so far as to plan their destruction. There can be no doubt that if violence had actually been used, the human race would have succumbed. For in a species of such high mental development, internecine war would have been a gross violation of its nature. It would never have been able to live down so shameful a spiritual disaster. Fortunately, however, at the 11th hour, common sense prevailed. The iconoclasts were permitted to carry on their research, and the whole race awaited the result. Two, exploration of time. This first attack upon the nature of time involved an immense cooperative work, both theoretical and practical. It was from biology that the first hint had come that the past persisted, and it would be necessary to restate the whole of biology and the physical sciences in terms of the new idea. On the practical side, it was necessary to undertake a great campaign of experiment, physiological and psychological. We cannot stay to watch this work. Millions of years passed by. Sometimes, for thousands of years at a spell, temporal research was the main preoccupation of the race. Sometimes it was thrust into the background or completely ignored during epochs which were dominated by other interests. Age after age passed, and always the effort of man in this sphere remained barren. Then at last there was a real success. A child had been selected from among those produced by an age-long breeding enterprise, directed towards the mastery of time. From infancy, this child's brain had been carefully controlled physiologically. Psychologically also, he had been subjected to a severe treatment, that he might be properly schooled for his strange task. In the presence of several scientists and historians, he was put into a kind of trance, and brought out of it again half an hour later. He was then asked to give an account telepathically of his experiences during the trance. Unfortunately, he was now so shattered that his evidence was almost unintelligible. After some months of rest, he was questioned again, and was able to describe a curious episode which turned out to be a terrifying incident in the girlhood of his dead mother. He seemed to have seen the incident through her eyes, and to have been aware of all her thoughts. This alone proved nothing, for he might have received the information from some living mind. Once more, therefore, and in spite of his entreaties, he was put into the peculiar trance. On awaking, he told a rambling story of little red people living in a squat white tower. It was clear that he was referring to the great brains and their attendants. But once more, this proved nothing, and before the account was finished, the child died. Another child was chosen, but was not put to the test until late in adolescence. After an hour of the trance, he woke and became terribly agitated, but forced himself to describe an episode which the historians assigned to the age of the Martian invasions. The importance of this incident lay in his account of a certain house with a carved granite portico, situated at the head of a waterfall in a mountain valley. He said he had found himself to be an old woman, and that he, or she, was being hurriedly helped out of the house by the other inmates. They watched a formless monster creep down the valley, destroy their house, and mangle two persons who failed to get away in time. Now this house was not at all typical of the second man, but must have expressed the whim of some freakish individual. From evidence derived from the boy himself, it proved possible to locate the valley with reference to a former mountain known to history. No valley survived in that spot, but deep excavations revealed the ancient slopes, the fall that had occasioned the waterfall, and the broken pillars. This and many similar incidents confirmed the fifth man in their new view of time. There followed an age in which the technique of direct inspection of the past was gradually improved, but not without tragedy. In the early stages, it was found impossible to keep the medium alive for more than a few weeks after his venture into the past. The experience seemed to set up a progressive mental disintegration which produced first insanity, then paralysis, and within a few months, death. This difficulty was at last overcome. By one means and another, a type of brain was produced capable of undergoing the strain of supratemporal experience without fatal results. An increasingly large proportion of the rising generation had now direct access to the past, and were engaged upon a great restatement of history in relation to their first-hand experience. But their excursions into the past were uncontrollable. They could not go where they wanted to go, but only where fate flung them, nor could they go of their own will, but only through a very complicated technique and with the cooperation of experts. After a time, the process was made much easier, in fact, too easy. The unfortunate medium might slip so easily into the trance that his days were eaten up by the past. He might suddenly fall to the ground and lie wrapped, inert, dependent on artificial feeding for weeks, months, even for years. Or a dozen times in the same day, he might be flung into a dozen different epochs of history. Or, still more distressing, his experience of past events might not keep pace with the actual rhythm of those events themselves. Thus he might behold the events of a month, or even a lifetime, fantastically accelerated so as to occupy a trance of no more than a day's duration. Or worse, he might find himself sliding backwards down the vista of the hours and experiencing events in an order the reverse of the natural order. Even the magnificent brains of the fifth man could not stand this. The result was maniacal behavior, followed by death. Another trouble also beset these first experimenters. Supratemporal experience proved to be like a dangerous and habit-forming drug. Those who venture into the past might become so intoxicated that they would try to spend every moment of their natural lives in roaming among past events. Thus gradually they would lose touch with the present, live in absent-minded brooding, fail to react normally to their environment, turn socially worthless, and often come actually to physical disaster through inability to look after themselves. Many more thousands of years passed before these difficulties and dangers were overcome. At length, however, the technique of supratemporal experience was so perfected that every individual could at will practice it with safety and could, within limits, project his vision into any locality of space-time which he desired to inspect. It was only possible, however, to see past events through the mind of some past organism no longer living. And in practice, only human minds, and to some extent the minds of the higher mammals, could be entered. The explorer retained throughout his adventure his own personality and system of memory. While experiencing the past individual's perceptions, memories, thoughts, desires, and in fact, the whole process and content of the past mind, the explorer continued to be himself and to react in terms of his own character, now condemning, now sympathizing, now critically enjoying the spectacle. The task of explaining the mechanism of this new faculty occupied the scientists and philosophers of the species for a very long period. The final account, of course, cannot be presented save by parable, for it was found necessary to recast many fundamental concepts in order to interpret the facts coherently. The only hint that I can give of the explanation is in saying, metaphorically of course, that the living brain had access to the past, not by way of some mysterious kind of racial memory, nor by some equally impossible journey up the stream of time, but by a partial awakening, as it were, into eternity, and into inspection of a minute tract of space-time through some temporal mind into the past, as though through an optical instrument. In the early experiments, the fantastic speeding, slowing, and reversal of the temporal process resulted from disorderly inspection. As a reader may either skim the pages of a book, or read at a comfortable pace, or dwell upon one word, or spell the sentence backwards, so, unintentionally, the novice in eternity might read or misread the mind that was presented to him. This new mode of experience, it should be noted, was the activity of living brains, though brains of a novel kind. Hence, what was to be discovered through the medium of eternity was limited by the particular exploring brain's capacity of understanding what was presented to it. And further, though the actual supratemporal contact with past events occupied no time in the brain's natural life, the assimilating of that moment to vision, the reduction of it to normal temporal memory in the normal brain structures, took time and had to be done during the period of the trance. To expect the neural structure to record the experience instantaneously would be to expect a complicated machine to effect a complicated readjustment without a process of readjusting. The access to the past had, of course, far-reaching effects upon the culture of the Fifth Man. Not only did it give them an incomparably more accurate knowledge of past events and insight into the motives of historical personages and into large-scale cultural movements, but also it effected a subtle change in their estimate of the importance of things. Though intellectually they had, of course, realized both the vastness and the richness of the past, now they realized it with an overwhelming vividness. Matters that had been known hitherto only historically, schematically, were now available to be lived through by intimate acquaintance. The only limit to such acquaintance was set by the limitations of the explorer's own brain capacity. Consequently, the remote past came to enter into a man and shape his mind in a manner in which only the recent past, through memory, has shaped him hitherto. Even before the new kind of experience was first acquired, the race had been, as was said, peculiarly under the spell of the past, but now it was infinitely more so. Hitherto the Fifth Man had been like stay-at-home folk who had read minutely of foreign parts, but had never traveled. Now they had become travelers experienced in all the continents of human time. The presences that had hitherto been ghostly were now presences of flesh and blood, seen in broad daylight. And so the moving instant called the present appeared no longer as the only infinitesimal real, but as the growing surface of an everlasting tree of existence. It was now the past that seemed most real, while the future still seemed void, and the present merely the impalpable becomingness of the indestructible past. The discovery that past events were after all persistent, inaccessible, was of course for the Fifth Man a source of deep joy, but also it caused him a new distress. While the past was thought of as a mere gulf of non-existence, the inconceivably great pain, misery, baseness that had fallen into that gulf could be dismissed as done with, and the will could be concentrated wholly on preventing such horrors from occurring in the future. But now, along with past joy, past distress was found to be everlasting, and those who, in the course of their voyaging in the past, encounter regions of eternal agony, came back distraught. It was easy to remind these harrowed explorers that if pain was eternal, so also was joy. Those who had endured travel in the tragic past were apt to dismiss such assurances with contempt, affirming that all the delights of the whole population of time could not compensate for the agony of one tortured individual. And anyhow, they declared, it was obvious that there had been no preponderance of joy over pain. Indeed, save in the modern age, pain had been overwhelmingly in excess. So seriously did these convictions prey upon the minds of the Fifth Man, that in spite of their own almost perfect social order, in which suffering had actually to be sought out as a tonic, they fell into despair. At all times, in all pursuits, the presence of the tragic past haunted them, poisoning their lives, sapping their strength. Lovers were ashamed of their delight in one another. As in the far-off days of sexual taboo, guilt crept between them and held their spirits apart even while their bodies were united. Let me hydrate here for a second, give me a moment. It was while 3. Voyaging in space. It was while they were struggling in the grip of this vast social melancholy and anxiously erasing some new vision by which to reinterpret or transcend the agony of the past, that the Fifth Men were confronted with a most unexpected physical crisis. It was discovered that something queer was happening to the moon. In fact, that the orbit of the satellite was narrowing in upon the Earth in a manner contrary to all the calculations of the scientists. The Fifth Men had long ago fashioned for themselves an all-embracing and minutely coherent system of natural sciences, every factor in which had been put to the test 1,000 times and had never been shaken. Imagine then their bewilderment at this extraordinary discovery. In ages when science was still fragmentary, a subversive discovery entailed merely a reorganization of some one department of science. But by now, such was the coherence of knowledge that any minute discrepancy of fact and theory must throw man into a state of complete intellectual vertigo. The evolution of the lunar orbit had, of course, been studied from time immemorial. Even the first man had learned that the moon must first withdraw from and subsequently once more approach the Earth, till it should reach a critical proximity and begin to break up into a swarm of fragments like the rings of Saturn. This view had been very thoroughly confirmed by the fifth man themselves. The satellite should have continued to withdraw for yet many hundreds of millions of years. But in fact, it was now observed that not only had the withdrawal ceased, but a comparatively rapid approach had begun. Observations and calculations were repeated, and ingenious theoretical explanations were suggested, but the truth remained completely hidden. It was left to a future and more brilliant species to discover the connection between a planet's gravitation and its cultural development. Meanwhile, the fifth man knew only that the distance between the Earth and the Moon was becoming smaller with ever-increasing rapidity. This discovery was satanic to a melancholy race. Men turned from the tragic past to the bewildering present and the uncertain future. For it was evident that, if the present acceleration of approach were to be maintained, the Moon would enter the critical zone and disintegrate in less than 10 million years, and further, that the fragments would not maintain themselves as a ring, but would soon crash upon the Earth. Heat generated by their impact would make the surface of the Earth impossible as the home of life. A short-lived and short-sighted species might well have considered 10 million years as equivalent to eternity. Not so the fifth man. Thinking primarily in terms of the race, they recognized at once that their whole social policy must now be dominated by this future catastrophe. Some there were indeed who at first refused to take the matter seriously, saying that there was no reason to believe that the moon's odd behavior would continue indefinitely. But as the years advanced, this view became increasingly improbable. Some of those who had spent much of their lives in exploration of the past now sought to explore the future also, hoping to prove that human civilization would always be discoverable on the Earth in no matter how remote the future. But the attempt to unveil the future by direct inspection failed completely. It was surmised erroneously that future events, unlike past events, must be strictly non-existent until their creation by the advancing present. Clearly, humanity must leave its native planet. Research was therefore concentrated on the possibility of flight through empty space and the suitability of neighboring worlds. The only alternatives were Mars and Venus. The former was by now without water and without atmosphere. The latter had a dense, moist atmosphere, but one which lacked oxygen. The surface of Venus, moreover, was known to be almost completely covered with a shallow ocean. Further, the planet was so hot by day that, even at the poles, man in his present state would scarcely survive. It did not take the fifth man many centuries to devise a tolerable means of voyaging in interplanetary space. Immense rockets were constructed, the motive power of which was derived from the annihilation of matter. The vehicle was propelled simply by the terrific pressure of radiation thus produced. Fuel for a voyage of many months or even years could, of course, easily be carried, since the annihilation of a minute amount of matter produced a vast wealth of energy. Moreover, when once the vessel had emerged from the Earth's atmosphere and had attained full speed, she would, of course, maintain it without the use of power from the rocket apparatus. The task of rendering the Ether ship properly manageable and decently habitable proved difficult, but not insurmountable. The first vessel to take the Ether was a cigar-shaped hull some 3,000 feet long, and built of metals whose artificial atoms were incomparably more rigid than anything hitherto known. Batteries of rocket apparatus at various points on the hull enabled the ship not only to travel forward, but to reverse, turn in any direction, or sidestep. Windows of an artificial transparent element, scarcely less strong than the metal of the hull, enabled the voyagers to look around them. Within there was ample accommodation for 100 persons and the provisions for 3 years. Air for the same period was manufactured in transit from protons and electrons stored under pressure comparable to that in the interior of a star. Heat was, of course, provided by the annihilation of matter. Powerful refrigeration would permit the vessel to approach the Sun almost to the orbit of Mercury. An artificial gravity system, based on the properties of the electromagnetic field, could be turned on and regulated at will, so as to maintain a more or less normal environment for the human organism. Give me a second. This pioneer ship was manned with a navigating crew and a company of scientists, and was successfully dispatched upon a trial trip. The intention was to approach close to the surface of the moon, possibly to circumnavigate it at an altitude of 10,000 feet, and to return without landing. For many days, those on Earth received radio messages from the vessel's powerful installation, reporting that all was going well. But suddenly the messages ceased, and no more was ever heard of the vessel. Almost at the moment of the last message, telescopes had revealed a sudden flash of light at a point on the vessel's course. It was therefore surmised that she had collided with a meteor and fused with the heat of the impact. Other vessels were built and dispatched on trial voyages. Many failed to return. Some got out of control and reported that they were heading for outer space or plunging toward the sun, their hopeless messages continuing until the last of the crew succumbed to suffocation. Other vessels returned successfully, but with crews haggard and distraught from long confinement in bad atmosphere. One, venturing to land on the moon, broke her back, so that the air rushed out of her, and her people died. After her last message was received, she was detected from the Earth as an added speck on the stipple surface of a lunar sea. As time passed, however, accidents became rarer. Indeed, so rare that trips in the void began to be a popular form of amusement. Literature of the period reverberates with the novelty of such experiences, with the sense that man had at last learned true flight and acquired the freedom of the solar system. Writers dwelt upon the shock of seeing, as the vessel soared and accelerated, the landscape dwindled to a mere illuminated disk or crescent, surrounded by constellations. They remarked also the awful remoteness and mystery which travelers experienced on these early voyages, with dazzling sunlight on one side of the vessel and dazzling bespangled night on the other. They describe how the intense sun spread his corona against a black and star-crowded sky. They expatiated also on the overwhelming interest of approaching another planet, of inspecting from the sky the still visible remains of Martian civilization, of groping through the cloud banks of Venus to discover islands in her almost coastless ocean, of daring an approach to Mercury, till the heat became insupportable in spite of the best refrigerating mechanism, of feeling a way across the belt of the asteroids and onwards toward Jupiter, till shortage of air and provisions forced a return. But though the mere navigation of space was thus easily accomplished, the major task was still untouched. It was necessary either to remake man's nature to suit another planet, or to modify conditions upon another planet to suit man's nature. The former alternative was repugnant to the fifth man. Obviously, it would entail an almost complete refashioning of the human organism. No existing individual could possibly be so altered as to live in the present conditions of Mars or Venus, and it would probably prove impossible to create a new being adapted to these conditions without sacrificing the brilliant and harmonious constitution of the extant species. On the other hand, Mars could not be made habitable without first being stocked with air and water, and such an undertaking seemed impossible. There was nothing for it then but to attack Venus. The polar surfaces of that planet, shielded by impenetrable depths of cloud, prove after all not unendurably hot. Subsequent generations might perhaps be modified so as to withstand even the subarctic and temperate climates. Oxygen was plentiful, but it was all tied up in chemical combination. Inevitably so, since oxygen combines very readily, and on Venus there was no vegetable life to exhale the free gas and replenish the ever-vanishing supply. It was necessary then to equip Venus with an appropriate vegetation, which in the course of ages should render the planet's atmosphere hospitable to man. The chemical and physical conditions on Venus had therefore to be studied in great detail, so that it might be possible to design a kind of life which would have a chance of flourishing. This research had to be carried out from within the ether ships or with gas helmets, since no human being could live in the natural atmosphere of the planet. We must not dwell upon the age of heroic research and adventure which now began. Observations of the lunar orbit were showing that 10 million years was too long an estimate of the future habitability of the Earth, and it was soon realized that Venus could not be made ready soon enough unless a more rapid change was set on foot. It was therefore decided to split up some of the ocean of the planet into hydrogen and oxygen by a vast process of electrolysis. This would have been a more difficult task had not the ocean been relatively free from salt, owing to the fact that there was so little dry land to be denuded of salts by rain and river. The oxygen thus formed by electrolysis would be allowed to mix with the atmosphere. The hydrogen had to be got rid of somehow, and an ingenious method was devised by which it should be ejected beyond the limits of the atmosphere at so great a speed that it would never return. Once sufficient free oxygen had been produced, the new vegetation would replenish the loss due to oxidation. This work was duly set on foot. Great automatic electrolyzing stations were founded on several of the islands, and biological research produced at length a whole flora of specialized vegetable types to cover the land surface of the planet. It was hoped that in less than 1,000,000 years, Venus would be fit to receive the human race, and the race fit to live on Venus. Meanwhile, a careful survey of the planet had been undertaken. Its land surface, scarcely more than 1,000th that of the Earth, consisted of an unevenly distributed archipelago of mountainous islands. The planet had evidently not long ago been through a mountain-forming era, for soundings prove its whole surface to be extravagantly corrugated. The ocean was subject to terrific storms and currents, for since the planet took several weeks to rotate, there was a great difference of temperature and atmospheric pressure between the almost Arctic hemisphere of night and the sweltering hemisphere of day. So great was the evaporation that open sky was almost never visible from any part of the planet's surface, and indeed the average daytime weather was a succession of thick fogs and fantastic thunderstorms. Rain in the evening was a continuous torrent, yet before night was over, the waves clattered with fragments of ice. Man looked upon his future home with loathing, and on his birthplace with an affection which became passionate. With his blue sky, his incomparable starry nights, his temperate and varied continents, his ample spaces of agriculture, wilderness, and park, his well-known beasts and plants, and all the material fabric of the most enduring of terrestrial civilizations, it seemed to the men and women who were planning flight almost a living thing imploring them not to desert it. They look often with hate at the quiet moon, now visibly larger than the moon of history. They revised again and again their astronomical and physical theories, hoping for some flaw which should render the moon's absurd behavior less mysterious, less terrifying. But they found nothing. It was as though a fiend out of some ancient myth had come to life in the modern world, to interfere with the laws of nature for man's undoing. Alright, we're not done with the chapter. Give me a second. Okay. I have to, give me a second. We have to take like 3 minutes of ads on Twitch. So we're gonna do that. And let's do that. We're gonna do that. We'll BRB. I'll leave you with the ambience and all that. Generally, I think it's best if we like break it off by chapters and all that. But we gotta run the ads for a moment. Oh, I'll tell you what. It's a bit cheeky of me. I'm gonna run 60 seconds of ads. And then when we're done with that, I'll run the 3 minutes. I'll read the no, actually, no. I'm overthinking it. Let's BRB, okay? We'll finish chapter 12. I think 4 is the last part of chapter 12, but I'm not sure. When we come back, okay? Stay tuned. Omatase shimashita. Thank you for waiting, Tajigen. We continue with this then. Chapter 12 should be finished. We will start the next one immediately. We'll see if we finish the next chapter before the next ad break. This is the pace we keep. Give me a second. I'm kind of gonna recenter myself here. I feel always so uncentered. Or actually, no, this is fine. Let's continue. 4. Preparing a new world. Another trouble now occurred. Several electrolysis stations on Venus were wrecked, apparently by submarine eruption. Also, a number of either ships, engaged in surveying the ocean, mysteriously exploded. The explanation was found when one of these vessels, though damaged, was able to return to the Earth. The commander reported that when the sounding line was drawn up, a large spherical object was seen to be attached to it. Closer inspection showed that this object was fastened to the sounding apparatus by a hook, and was indeed unmistakably artificial, a structure of small metal plates riveted together. While preparations were being made to bring the object within the ship, it happened to bump against the hull, and then it exploded. Evidently, there must be intelligent life somewhere in the ocean of Venus. Evidently, the marine Venerians resented the steady depletion of their aqueous world, and were determined to stop it. The terrestrials had assumed that water in which no free oxygen was dissolved could not support life. But observations soon revealed that in this worldwide ocean there were many living species, some sessile, others free-swimming, some microscopic, others as large as whales. The basis of life in these creatures lay not in photosynthesis and chemical combination, but in the controlled disintegration of radioactive atoms. Venus was particularly rich in these atoms, and still contained certain elements which had long ago ceased to exist on the Earth. The oceanic fauna subsisted in the destruction of minute quantities of radioactive atoms throughout its tissues. Several of the Venerian species had attained considerable mastery over their physical environment, and were able to destroy one another very competently with various mechanical contrivances. Many types were indeed definitely intelligent and versatile within certain limits. And of these intelligent types, one had come to dominate all the others by virtue of his superior intelligence, and had constructed a genuine civilization on the basis of radioactive power. These most developed of all the Venerian creatures were beings of about the size and shape of a swordfish. They had 3 manipulative organs, normally sheathed within the long sword, but capable of extension beyond its point as 3-branch muscular tentacles. They swam with a curious screw-like motion of their bodies and triple tails. 3 fins enabled them to steer. They had also organs of phosphorescence, vision, touch, and something analogous to hearing. They appeared to reproduce asexually, laying eggs in the ooze of the ocean bed. They had no need of nutrition in the ordinary sense, but in infancy they seemed to gather enough radioactive matter to keep them alive for many years. Each individual, when his stock was running out and he began to be feeble, was either destroyed by his juniors or buried in a radioactive mine, to rise from this living death in a few months completely rejuvenated. At the bottom of the Venerian Ocean, these creatures thronged in cities of proliferated coral-like buildings, equipped with many complex articles, which must have constituted the necessities and luxuries of their civilization. So much was ascertained by the terrestrials in the course of their submarine exploration, but the mental life of Venerians remained hidden. It was clear, indeed, that like all living things, they were concerned with self-maintenance and the exercise of their capacities, but of the nature of these capacities, little was discoverable. Clearly they used some kind of symbolic language, based on mechanical vibrations set up in the water by the snapping claws of their tentacles, but their more complex activities were quite unintelligible. All that could be recorded with certainty was that they were much addicted to warfare, even to warfare between groups of one species, and that even in the stress of military disaster, they maintained a feverish production of material articles of all sorts, which they proceeded to destroy and neglect. One activity was observed which was particularly mysterious. At certain seasons, 3 individuals suddenly developed unusual luminosity would approach one another with rhythmic swayings and tremors, and would then rise on their tails and press their bodies together. Sometimes at this stage an excited crowd would collect, whirling around the tree like driven snow. The chief performers would now furiously tear one another to pieces with their crab-like pincers, till nothing was left but tangled shreds of flesh, the great sores, and the still twitching claws. The terrestrials, observing these matters with difficulty, at first suspected some kind of sexual intercourse, but no reproduction was ever traced to this source. Possibly the behavior had once served a biological end, and had now become a useless ritual. Possibly it was a kind of voluntary religious sacrifice. More probably, it was of a quite different nature, unintelligible to the human mind. As man's activities on Venus became more extensive, the Venerians became more energetic in seeking to destroy him. They could not come out of the ocean to grapple with him, for they were deep-sea organisms. Deprived of oceanic pressure, they would have burst. But they contrived to hurl high explosives into the centers of the islands, or to undermine them from tunnels. The work of electrolysis was thus very seriously hampered, and as all efforts to parley with the Venerians failed completely, it was impossible to effect a compromise. The fifth men were thus faced with a grave moral problem. What right had man to interfere in a world already possessed by beings who were obviously intelligent, even though their mental life was incomprehensible to man? Long ago, man himself had suffered at the hands of Martian invaders, who doubtless regarded themselves as more noble than the human race, and now man was committing a similar crime. On the other hand, either the migration to Venus must go forward, or humanity must be destroyed, for it seemed quite certain by now that the moon would fall, and at no very distant date. And though man's understanding of the Venerians was so incomplete, what he did know of them strongly suggested that they were definitely inferior to himself in mental range. The judgment might of course be mistaken. The Venerians might after all be so superior to man that man could not get an inkling of their superiority. But this argument would apply equally to jellyfish and microorganisms. Judgment had to be passed according to the evidence available. So far as man could judge at all in the matter, he was definitely the higher type. There was another fact to be taken into account. The life of the Venerian organism depended on the existence of radioactive atoms. Since those atoms are subject to disintegration, they must become rare. Venus was far better supplied than the Earth in this respect, but there must inevitably come a time when there would be no more radioactive matter in Venus. Now submarine research showed that the Venerian fauna had once been much more extensive, and that the increasing difficulty of procuring radioactive matter was already the great limiting factor of civilization. Thus the Venerians were doomed, and men would merely hasten their destruction. It was hoped, of course, that in colonizing Venus, mankind would be able to accommodate itself without seriously interfering with the native population. But this proved impossible for two reasons. In the first place, the natives seemed determined to destroy the invader, even if they should destroy themselves in the process. Titanic explosions were engineered, which caused the invaders serious damage, but also strewed the ocean surface with thousands of dead Venerians. Secondly, it was found that, as electrolysis poured more and more free oxygen into the atmosphere, the ocean absorbed some of the potent element back into itself by solution, and this dissolved oxygen had a disastrous effect upon the oceanic organisms. Their tissues began to oxidize. They were burnt up, internally and externally, by a slow fire. Man dared not stop the process of electrolysis until the atmosphere had become as rich in oxygen as its native air. Long before this state was reached, it was already clear that the Venerians were beginning to feel the effects of the poison, and that in a few thousand years at most, they would be exterminated. He was therefore determined to put them out of their misery as quickly as possible. Man could by now walk abroad on the islands of Venus, and indeed the first settlements were already being founded. They were thus able to build a fleet of powerful submarine vessels to scour the ocean and destroy the whole native fauna. This vast slaughter influenced the mind of the fifth human species in two opposite directions, now flinging it into despair, now rousing it to grave elation. For on the one hand, the horror of the slaughter produced a haunting guiltiness in all men's minds, an unreasoning disgust with humanity for having been driven to murder in order to save itself. And this guiltiness combined with the purely intellectual loss of self-confidence, which had been produced by the failure of science to account for the moon's approach. It reawakened also that other quite irrational sense of guilt, which had been bred of sympathy with the everlasting distress of the past. Together, these three influences tended toward racial neurosis. On the other hand, a very different mood sometimes sprang from the same three sources. After all, the failure of science was a challenge to be gladly accepted. It opened up a wealth of possibilities hitherto unimagined. Even the unalterable distress of the past constituted a challenge, for in some strange manner the present and future, it was said, must transfigure the past. As for the murder of Venerian life, it was indeed terrible, but right. It had been committed without hate, indeed, rather in love. For as the Navy proceeded with its relentless work, it had gathered much insight into the life of the natives, and had learned to admire, even in a sense to love, while it killed. This mood, of inexorable yet not ruthless will, intensified the spiritual sensibility of the species, refined, so to speak, its spiritual hearing, and revealed to it tones and themes in the universal music which were hitherto obscure. Which of these two moods, despair or courage, would triumph? All depended on the skill of the species to maintain a high degree of vitality in untoward circumstances. Man now busied himself in preparing this new home. Many kinds of plant life, derived from the terrestrial stock, but bred for the Venerian environment, now began to swarm on the islands and in the sea. For so restricted was the land surface, the great areas of ocean had to be given over to specially designed marine plants, which now formed immense floating continents of vegetable matter. On the least torrid islands appeared habitable pylons, forming an architectural forest with vegetation on every acre of free ground. Even so, it would be impossible for Venus ever to support the huge population of Earth. Steps had therefore been taken to ensure that the birth rate should fall far short of the death rate. So that when the time should come, the race might emigrate without leaving any living members behind. No more than 100 million, it was reckoned, could live tolerably on Venus. The population had therefore to be reduced to 100 of its former size, and since, in the terrestrial community, with its vast social and cultural activity, every individual had fulfilled some definite function in society, it was obvious that the new community must be not merely small, but mentally impoverished. Hitherto, each individual had been enriched by intercourse with a far more intricate and diverse social environment than would be possible on Venus. Such was the prospect when at length it was judged advisable to leave the Earth to its fate. The moon was now so huge that it periodically turned day into night and night into a ghastly day. Prodigious tides and distressful weather conditions had already spoiled the amenities of the Earth and done great damage to the fabric of civilization. And so at length, humanity reluctantly took flight. Some centuries passed before the migration was completed, before Venus had received not only the whole remaining human population, but also representatives of many other species of organisms, and all the most precious treasures of man's culture. Chapter 13. 1. Taking root again. Man's sojourn on Venus lasted somewhat longer than his whole career on the Earth. From the days of Pithecanthropus to the final evacuation of his native planet, he passed, as we have seen, through a bewildering diversity of form and circumstance. On Venus, though the human type was somewhat more constant biologically, it was scarcely less variegated in culture. To give an account on this period, even on the minute scale that has been adopted hitherto, would entail another volume. I can only sketch its bare outline. The sapling humanity, transplanted into foreign soil, withers at first almost to the root, slowly readjusts itself, grows into strength and a certain permanence of form, burgeons season by season, with leaf and flower of many successive civilizations and cultures, sleeps winter by winter through many ages of reduced vitality, but at length, to force the metaphor, avoids recurrent defeat by attaining an evergreen constitution and a continuous efflorescence. Then once more, through the whim of fate, it is plucked up by the roots and cast upon another world. The first human settlers on Venus knew well that life would be a sorry business. They had done their best to alter the planet to suit human nature, but they could not make Venus into another Earth. The land surface was minute. The climate was almost unendurable. The extreme difference of temperature between the protracted day and night produced incredible storms, rain like 1,000 contiguous waterfalls, terrifying electrical disturbances, and fogs in which a man could not see his own feet. To make matters worse, the oxygen supply was as yet barely enough to render the air breathable. Worse still, the liberated hydrogen was not always successfully ejected from the atmosphere. It would sometimes mingle with the air to form an explosive mixture, and sooner or later there would occur a vast atmospheric flash. Recurrent disasters of this sort destroyed the architecture and the human inhabitants of many islands, and further reduced the oxygen supply. In time, however, the increasing vegetation made it possible to put an end to the dangerous process of electrolysis. Meanwhile, these atmospheric explosions crippled the race so seriously that it was unable to cope with a more mysterious trouble which beset it sometime after the migration. A new and inexplicable decay of the digestive organs, which first occurred as a rare disease, threatened within a few centuries to destroy mankind. The physical effects of this plague were scarcely more disastrous than the psychological effects of the complete failure to master it. For, what with the mystery of the moon's vagaries and the deep-seated, unreasoning sense of guilt produced by the extermination of the Venerians, man's self-confidence was already seriously shaken, and his highly organized mentality began to show symptoms of derangement. The new plague was indeed finally traced to something in the Venerian water, and was supposed to be due to certain molecular groupings, formerly rare, but subsequently fostered by the presence of terrestrial organic matter in the ocean. No cure was discovered. And now another plague seized upon the enfeebled race. Human tissues had never perfectly assimilated the Martian units, which were the means of telepathic communication. The universal ill health now favored a kind of cancer of the nervous system, which was due to the ungoverned proliferation of these units. The harrowing results of this disease may be left unmentioned. Century by century it increased, and even those who did not actually contract the sickness lived in constant terror of madness. These troubles were aggravated by the devastating heat. The hope that, as the generations passed, human nature would adapt itself even to the more sultry regions seemed to be unfounded. Far otherwise, within 1,000 years the once populous Arctic and Antarctic islands were almost deserted. Out of each 100 of the great pylons, scarcely more than 2 were inhabited, and those only by a few plague-stricken and broken-spirited human relics. These alone were left to turn their telescopes upon the Earth and watch the unexpectedly delayed bombardment of their native world by the fragments of the moon. Population decreased still further. Each brief generation was slightly less well developed than its parents. Intelligence declined. Education became superficial and restricted. Contact with the past was no longer possible. Art lost its significance, and philosophy's dominion over the minds of men. Even applied science began to be too difficult. Unskilled control of the subatomic sources of power led to a number of disasters, which finally gave rise to a superstition that all tampering with nature was wicked, and all the ancient wisdom a snare of man's enemy. Books, instruments, all the treasures of human culture were therefore burnt. Only the perdurable buildings resisted destruction. Of the incomparable world order of the fifth man, nothing was left but a few island tribes, cut off from one another by the ocean, and from the rest of space-time by the depths of their own ignorance. After many thousands of years, human nature did begin to adapt itself to the climate and to the poisoned water without which life was impossible. At the same time, a new variety of the fifth species now began to appear. in which the Martian units were not included. Thus at last the race regained a certain mental stability, at the expense of his faculty of telepathy, which man was not to regain until almost the last phase of his career. Meanwhile, though he had recovered somewhat from the effects of an alien world, the glory that had been was no more. Let us therefore hurry through the ages that passed, before noteworthy events again occurred. In early days on Venus, men had gathered their foodstuff from the great floating islands of vegetable matter, which had been artificially produced before the migration. But as the oceans became populous with modifications of the terrestrial fauna, the human tribes turned more and more to fishing. Under the influence of its marine environment, one branch of the species assumed such an aquatic habit that in time it actually began to develop biological adaptations for marine life. It is perhaps surprising that man was still capable of spontaneous variation, but the fifth human species was artificial and had always been prone to epidemics of mutation. After some million years of variation and selection, there appeared a very successful species of seal-like subman. The whole body was molded to streamlines, the lung capacity was greatly developed, the spine had elongated and increased in flexibility. The legs were shrunken, grown together, and flattened into a horizontal rudder. The arms also were diminutive and fin-like, though they still retained the manipulative forefinger and thumb. The head had shrunk into the body and looked forward in the direction of swimming. Strong carnivorous teeth, emphatic gregariousness, and a new, almost human cunning in the chase combined to make these seal men lords of the ocean. And so they remained for many million years, until a more human race, annoyed at their piscatorial success, harpooned them out of existence. For another branch of the degenerated fifth species had retained a more terrestrial habit in the ancient human form. Sadly reduced in stature and in brain, these abject beings were so unlike the original invaders that they are rightly considered the new species, and may therefore be called the sixth man. Age after age, they gain a precarious livelihood by grubbing roots upon the forest-clad islands, trapping the innumerable birds, and catching fish in the tidal inlets with ground bait. Not infrequently they devoured, or were devoured by, their seal-like relatives. So restricted and constant was the environment of these human remnants that they remained biologically and culturally stagnant for some millions of years. At length, however, geological events afforded man's nature once more the opportunity of change. A mighty warping of the planet's crust produced an island almost as large as Australia. In time this was peopled, and from the clash of tribes a new and versatile race emerged. Once more there was methodical tillage, craftsmanship, complex social organization, and adventure in the realm of thought. During the next 200 million years, all the main phases of man's life on Earth were many times repeated on Venus with characteristic differences. Theocratic empires, free and intellectualistic island cities, insecure overlordship of feudal archipelagos, rivalries of high priest and emperor, religious feuds over the interpretation of sacred scriptures, recurrent fluctuations of thought from naive animism through polytheism, conflicting monotheisms, and all the desperate isms by which mind seeks to blur the severe outline of truth. Recurrent fashions of comfort-seeking fantasy and cold intelligence, social disorders through the misuse of volcanic or wind power in industry, business empires and pseudo-communistic empires, all these forms flitted over the changing substance of mankind again and again. As in an enduring hearth fire, there appear and vanish the infinitely diverse forms of flame and smoke. But all the while the brief spirits, in whose mass configurations these forms inherit, were intent chiefly on the primitive needs of food, shelter, companionship, crowd-lost, love-making, the two-edged relationship of parent and child, the exercise of muscle and intelligence in facile sport. Very seldom, only in rare moments of clarity, only after ages of misapprehension, that a few of them, here and there, now and again, begin to have the deeper insight into the world's nature and man's. And no sooner had this precious insight begun to propagate itself than it would be blotted out by some small or great disaster, by epidemic disease, by the spontaneous disruption of society, by an access of racial imbecility, by a prolonged bombardment of meteorites, or by the mere cowardice and vertigo that dare not look down the precipice of fact. Two, the Flying Man. We need not dwell upon these multitudinous reiterations of culture, but must glance for a moment at the last phase of this sixth human species, so that we may pass on to the artificial species which it produced. Throughout their career, the six men had often been fascinated by the idea of flight. The bird was again and again their most sacred symbol. Their monotheism was said to be worshipped not of a god-man, but of a god-bird, conceived now as the divine sea eagle, winged with power, now as the giant swift, winged with mercy, now as a disembodied spirit of air, and once as the bird god that became man to endow the human race with flight, physical and spiritual. It was inevitable that flight should obsess man on Venus, for the planet afforded but a cramping home for groundlings, and the riotous efflorescence of avian species shamed man's pedestrian habit. When in due course the six men attained knowledge and power comparable to that of the first man at their height, they invented flying machines of various types. Many times indeed, mechanical flight was rediscovered and lost again with the downfall of civilization. But at its best it was regarded only as a makeshift. And when at length, with the advance of the biological sciences, the six men were in a position to influence the human organism itself, they determined to produce a true flying man. Many civilizations strove vainly for this result, sometimes half-heartedly, sometimes with religious earnestness. Finally, the most enduring and brilliant of all the civilizations of the six men actually attained the goal. The seventh men were pygmies, scarcely heavier than the largest of terrestrial flying birds. Through and through they were organized for flight. A leathery membrane spread from the foot to the tip of the immensely elongating and strengthened middle finger. The three outer fingers, equally elongated, served as ribs to the membrane, while the index and thumb remained free from manipulation. The body assumed the streamlines of a bird, and was covered with a deep quilt of feathery wool. This and the silken down of the flight membranes varied greatly from individual to individual in coloring and texture. On the ground, the seven men walked much as other human beings, for the flight membranes were folded close to the legs and body, and hung from the arms like exaggerated sleeves. In flight, the legs were held extended as a flattened tail, with the feet locked together by the big toes. The breastbone was greatly developed as a keel, and as a base for the muscles of flight. The other bones were hollow, for lightness, and their internal surfaces were utilized as supplementary lungs, for, like the birds, these flying men had to maintain a high rate of oxidation, a state which others would regard as fever was normal to them. Their brains were given ample tracks for the organization of prowess in flight. In fact, it was found possible to equip the species with a system of reflexes for aerial balance, and a true, though artificial, instinctive aptitude for flight and interest in flight. Compared with their makers, their brain volume was of necessity small, but their whole neural system was very carefully organized. Also, it matured rapidly, and was extremely facile in the acquirement of new modes of activity. This was very desirable, for the individual's natural life period was but 50 years, and in most cases it was deliberately cut short by some impossible feat at about 40, or whenever the symptoms of old age began to be felt. Of all human species, these bat-like flying men, the seventh man, were probably the most carefree. Gifted with harmonious physique and gay temperament, they came into a social heritage well adapted to their nature. There was no occasion for them, as there had often been for some others, to regard the world as fundamentally hostile to life, or themselves as essentially deformed. Of quick intelligence in respect of daily personal affairs and social organization, they were untroubled by the insatiable loss of understanding. Not that they were an unintellectual race, for they soon formulated a beautifully systematic account of experience. They clearly perceived, however, that the perfect sphere of their thought was but a bubble adrift in chaos. Yet it was an elegant bubble, and the system was true, in its own gay and frankly insincere manner, true as significant metaphor, not literally true. What more, it was asked, could be expected of human intellect? Adolescents were encouraged to study the ancient problems of philosophy for no reason but to convince themselves of the futility of probing beyond the limits of the orthodox system. Prick the bubble of thought at any point, it was said, and you shatter the whole of it. And since thought is one of the necessities of human life, it must be preserved. Give me a second. Natural science was taken over from the earlier species with how contemptuous gratitude as a necessary means of sane adjustment to the environment. Its practical applications were valued as the ground of the social order. But as the millennia advanced and society approached that remarkable perfection and stability which was to endure for many million years, scientific inventiveness became less and less needful, and science itself was relegated to the infant schools. History also was given an outline during childhood and subsequently ignored. This curiously sincere intellectual insincerity was due to the fact that the seventh men were chiefly concerned with matters other than abstract thought. It is difficult to give to members of the first human species an inkling of the great preoccupation of these flying men. To say that it was flight would be true, yet far less than the truth. To say that they sought to live dangerously and vividly, to crowd as much experience as possible into each moment, would again be a caricature of the truth. On the physical plane, indeed, the universe of flight, with all the variety of peril and skill afforded by a tempestuous atmosphere, was every individual's chief medium of self-expression. Yet it was not flight itself, but the spiritual aspect of flight, which obsessed the species. In the air and on the ground, the seven men were different beings. Whenever they exercised themselves in flight, they suffered a remarkable change of spirit. Much of their time had to be spent on the ground, since most of the work upon which civilization rested was impossible in the air. Moreover, life in the air was life at high pressure and necessitated spells of recuperation on the ground. In their pedestrian phase, the seven men were sober folk, mildly bored, yet in the main cheerful, humorously impatient of the drabness and irk of pedestrian affairs, but ever supported by memory and anticipation of the vivid life of the air. Often they were tired, after the strain of that other life, but seldom were they despondent or lazy. Indeed, in the routine of agriculture and industry, they were industrious as the wingless ants. Yet they worked in a strange mood of attentive absent-mindedness, for their hearts were ever in the air. So long as they could have frequent periods of aviation, they remained bland even on the ground. But if for any reason such as illness they were confined to the ground for a long period, they pined, developed acute melancholia, and died. Their makers had so contrived them that with the onset of any very great pain or misery, their hearts should stop. Thus they were to avoid all serious distress. But in fact, this merciful device worked only on the ground. In the air they assumed a very different and more heroic nature, which their makers had not foreseen, though indeed it was a natural consequence of their design. In the air the flying man's heart beat more powerfully, his temperature rose, his sensation became more vivid and more discriminate, his intelligence more agile and penetrating. He experienced a more intense pleasure or pain in all that happened to him. It would not be true to say that he became more emotional, rather the reverse, if by emotionality is meant enslavement to the emotions. For the most remarkable features of the aerial phase was that this enhanced power of appreciation was dispassionate. So long as the individual was in the air, whether in lonely struggle with the storm, or in the ceremonial ballet with sky-darkening hosts of his fellows, whether in the ecstatic love dance with a sexual partner, or in solitary and meditative circlings far above the world, whether his enterprise was fortunate, or he found himself dismembered by the hurricane and crashing to death, always the gay and the tragic fortunes of his own person were regarded equally with detached aesthetic delight. Even when his dearest companion was mutilated or destroyed by some aerial disaster, he exulted, though also he would give his own life in the hope of effecting a rescue. But very soon after he had returned to the ground, he would be overwhelmed with grief, would strive vainly to recapture the lost vision, and would perhaps die of heart failure. Even when, as happened occasionally in the wild climate of Venus, a whole aerial population was destroyed by some worldwide atmospheric tumult, the few broken survivors, so long as they could remain in the air, exulted And actually, while at length they sank exhausted toward the ground, toward certain disillusionment and death, they laughed inwardly. Yet after an hour after they had alighted, their constitution would be changed, their vision lost. They would remember only the horror of the disaster, and the memory would kill them. No wonder the 7 men grudged every moment that was passed on the ground. While they were in the air, of course, the prospect of a pedestrian interlude, or indeed of endless pedestrianism, though in a manner repugnant, would be accepted with unswerving gaiety, but while they were on the ground, they grudged bitterly to be there. Early in the career of the species, the proportion of aerial to terrestrial hours was increased by a biological invention. A minute food plant was produced which spent the winter rooted in the ground, and the summer adrift in the sunlit upper air, engaged solely in photosynthesis. Henceforth, the populations of the flying men were able to browse upon the bright pastures of the sky, like swallows. As the ages passed, material civilization became more and more simplified. Needs which could not be satisfied without terrestrial labor tended to be outgrown. Manufactured articles became increasingly rare. Books were no longer written or read. In the main, indeed, they were no longer necessary. But to some extent their place was taken by verbal tradition and discussion in the upper air. Of the arts, music, spoken lyric and epic verse, and the supreme art of winged dance were constantly practiced. The rest vanished. Many of the sciences inevitably faded into tradition, yet the true scientific spirit was preserved in a very exact meteorology, a sufficient biology, and a human psychology surpassed only by the 2nd and 5th species at their height. None of these sciences, however, was taken very seriously, save in its practical applications. For instance, psychology explained the ecstasy of flight very neatly as a febrile and irrational beatitude. But no one was disconcerted by this theory, for everyone, while on the wing, felt it to be merely an amusing half-truth. The social order of the 7 men was in essence neither utilitarian, nor humanistic, nor religious, but aesthetic. Every act and every institution were to be justified as contributing to the perfect form of the community. Sorry, give me 1 second. Let's try that paragraph from the start. The social order of the 7 men was in essence neither utilitarian, nor humanistic, nor religious, but aesthetic. Every act and every institution were to be justified as contributing to the perfect form of the community. Even social prosperity was conceived as merely the medium in which beauty should be embodied, the beauty, namely, of vivid individual lives harmoniously related. Yet not only for the individual, but even for the race itself, so the wise insisted, death on the wing was more excellent than prolonged life on the ground. Better, far better, would be racial suicide than a future of pedestrianism. Yet though both the individual and the race were conceived as instrumental to objective beauty, there was nothing religious in any ordinary sense in this conviction. The 7 men were completely without interest in the universal and the unseen. The beauty which they sought to create was ephemeral and very largely sensuous, and they were well content that it should be so. Personal immortality, said at dying sage, would be as tedious as an endless song. Equally so with the race. The lovely flame of which we all are members must die, he said, must die, for without death she would fall short of beauty. For close on 100 million terrestrial years, this aerial society endured with little change. On many of the islands throughout this period stood even yet a number of the ancient pylons, though repaired almost beyond recognition. In these nests the men and women of the 7 species slept through the long Venerian nights, crowded like roosting swallows. By day the same great towers were sparsely peopled with those who were serving their turn in industry, while in the fields and on the sea others labored, but most were in the air. Many would be skimming the ocean, to plunge, gannet-like, for fish. Many circling over land or sea, would now and again swoop like hawks upon the wildfowl which formed the chief meat of the species. Others, 40 or 50,000 feet above the waves, where even the plentiful atmosphere of Venus was scarcely capable of supporting them, will be soaring, circling, sweeping, for pure joy of flight. Others in the calm and sunshine of high altitudes, would be hanging effortless upon some steady upcurrent of air for meditation and the rapture of mere percipience. Not a few love-intoxicated pairs would be entwining their curses in aerial patterns, in spires, cascades, and true love knots of flight, presently to embrace and drop 10,000 feet in bodily union. Some would be driving hither and thither through the green mists of vegetable particles, gathering the manna in their open mouths. Companies, circling together, would be discussing matters social or aesthetic. Others would be singing together or listening to recitative epic verse. Thousands gathering in the sky like migratory birds, would perform mass convolutions, reminiscent of the vast mechanical aerial choreography of the First World State, but more vital and expressive, as a bird's flight is more vital than the flight of any machine. And all the while there would be some, solitary or in companies, who, either in the pursuit of fish and wildfowl, or out of pure devilment, pitted their strength and skill against the hurricane, often tragically, but never without zest and laughter of the spirit. It may seem to some incredible that the culture of the Seven Men should have lasted so long. Surely it must either have decayed through mere monotony and stagnation, or have advanced into richer experience. But no. Generation succeeded generation, and each was too short-lived to outlast its young delight and discover boredom. Moreover, so perfect was the adjustment of these beings to their world, that even if they had lived for centuries, they would have felt no need of change. Flight provided them with intense physical acceleration, and with the physical basis of a genuine and ecstatic, though limited, spiritual experience. In this their supreme attainment they rejoice not only in the diversity of flight itself, but also in the perceived beauties of their variegated world, and most of all, perhaps, in the thousand lyric and epic ventures of human intercourse in an aerial community. The end of this seemingly everlasting Elysium was nevertheless involved in the very nature of the species. In the first place, as the ages lengthened into eons, the generations preserved less and less of the ancient scientific lore, for it became insignificant to them. The aerial community had no need of it. This loss of mere information did not matter, so long as their condition remained unaltered, but in due course, biological changes began to undermine them. The species had always been prone to a certain biological instability. A proportion of infants, varying with circumstances, had always been misshapen, and the deformity had generally been such as to make flight impossible. The normal infant was able to fly early in its second year. If some accident prevented it from doing so, it invariably fell into a decline and died before its third year was passed. But many of the deformed types, being the result of a partial reversion to the pedestrian nature, were able to live on indefinitely without flight. According to a merciful custom, these cripples had always to be destroyed. But at length, owing to the gradual exhaustion of a certain marine salt essential to the high-strung nature of the seventh man, infants were more often deformed than true to type. The world population declined so seriously that the organized aerial life of the community could no longer be carried on according to the time-honored aesthetic principles. No one knew how to check this racial decay, but many felt that with greater biological knowledge, it might be avoided. A disastrous policy was now adopted. It was decided to spare a carefully selected proportion of the deformed infants, those namely which, though doomed to pedestrianism, were likely to develop high intelligence. Thus it was hoped to raise a specialized group of persons whose work should be biological research untrammeled by the intoxication of flight. The brilliant cripples that resulted from this policy looked at existence from a new angle. Deprived of the supreme experience from which their fellows lived, envious of a bliss which they knew only by report, yet contemptuous of the naive mentality which cared for nothing, it seemed, but physical exercise, love-making, the beauty of nature, and the elegances of society, these flightless intelligences saw satisfaction almost wholly in the life of research and scientific control. At the best, however, they were a tortured and resentful race, for their natures were fashioned for the aerial life which they could not lead. Although they received from the winged folk just treatment and a certain compassionate respect, they writhed under this kindness, locked their hearts against all the orthodox values, and sought out new ideals. Within a few centuries they had rehabilitated the life of intellect, and with the power that knowledge gives, they had made themselves masters of the world. The amiable flyers were surprised, perplexed, even pained, and yet withal amused. Even when it became evident that the pedestrians were determined to create a new world order in which there would be no place for the beauties of natural flight, the flyers were only distressed while they were on the ground. The islands were becoming crowded with machinery and flightless industrialists. In the air itself, the winged folk found themselves outstripped by the base but effective instruments of mechanical flight. Wings became a laughingstock, and the life of natural flight was condemned as a barren luxury. It was ordained that in future every flyer must serve the pedestrian world order, or starve. And as the cultivation of wind-borne plants had been abandoned, and fishing and fowling rights were strictly controlled, this law was no empty form. At first it was impossible for the flyers to work on the ground for long hours, day after day, without incurring serious ill health and an early death. But the pedestrian physiologists invented a drug which preserved the poor wage slaves in something like physical health and actually prolonged their life. No drug, however, could restore their spirit, for their normal aerial habit was reduced to a few tired hours of recreation once a week. Meanwhile, breeding experiments were undertaken to produce a wholly wingless large brain type, and finally a law was enacted by which all winged infants must be either mutilated or destroyed. At this point, the flyers made an heroic but ineffectual bid for power. They attacked the pedestrian population from the air. In reply, the enemy rode them down in his great airplanes and blew them to pieces with high explosive. The fighting squadrons of the natural flyers were finally driven to the ground in a remote and barren island. Thither the whole flying population, a mere remnant of its former strength, fled out of every civilized archipelago in search of freedom. The whole population save the sick who committed suicide and all infants that could not yet fly. These were stifled by their mothers or next of kin in obedience to a decree of the leaders. About 1 million men, women, and children, some of whom were scarcely old enough for the prolonged flight, now gathered on the rocks, regardless that there was not food in the neighborhood for a great company. Their leaders, conferring together, saw clearly that the day of flying man was done, and that it would be more fitting for a high-souled race to die at once than to drag on in subjection to contemptuous masters. They therefore ordered the population to take part in an act of racial suicide that should at least make death a noble gesture of freedom. The people received the message while they were resting on the stony moorland. A wail of sorrow broke from them. It was checked by the speaker, who bade them strive to see, even on the ground, the beauty of the thing that was to be done. They could not see it, but they knew that if they had the strength to take wing again, they would see it clearly, almost as soon as their tired muscles bore them aloft. There was no time to waste, for many were already faint with hunger and anxious lest they should fail to rise. At the appointed signal, the whole population rose into the air with a deep roar of wings. Sorrow was left behind. Even the children, when their mothers explained what was to be done, accepted their fate with zest, though had they learned of it on the ground, they would have been terror-stricken. The company now flew steadily west, forming themselves into a double file many miles long. The cone of a volcano appeared over the horizon and rose as they approached. The leaders pressed on towards his ruddy smoke plume, and unflinchingly, couple by couple, the whole multitude darted into its fiery breath and vanished. So ended the career of Flying Man. We're not done with the chapter yet, but I think that is a very good point in which to do another BRB with 3 minutes of ads and all that. At least for the Twitch side of things, when it comes to having ads. You have seen how it already skips over some things, right? How it already it went through the end of the 5th man, the evolution into the 6th man, which is still evolution to an extent. They're still intelligent enough. They are pretty much like the 1st man. All the mistakes that the 1st man committed were done. The civilization, as it has been known on Earth as of 2026, rose and fell in many ways, and a bit of the future of the world state and all that. It happened in Venus as well. And then the 7th man came. It didn't even say how the 6th man ceased to be, but just transition into one or another. The sixth men eventually just collapsed, fell to the wayside as the seventh men did their thing. Because initially they weren't just like devoid of sciences or advanced civilization, as it says later here. So they would have all of that. Sorry, let me also okay. Like there's all that. And already we have seen the end of the seventh man, and we're on to the eighth man very soon. Like it's already, and we made it to Venus, by the way. We made it to Venus already. We definitely have Venerians exterminated and all that, and well, we haven't even finished chapter 13. We're gonna go beyond that too. So let's continue in a moment, alright? Just a few minutes, we'll be right back. Thank you for waiting, Tajigen. Omatase shimashita. Yes, the outbreak is indeed finishing now. Over on the Twitch side of things, that is. Alright. Alright. Let us continue then. The seventh men are no more. We continue now here. 3. A minor astronomical event. The flightless yet still half-avian race that now possess the planet settled down to construct a society based on industry and science. After many vicissitudes of fortune and of aim, they produced a new human species, the eighth man. These long-headed and substantial folk were designed to be strictly pedestrian, physically and mentally. Apt for manipulation, calculation, and invention, they very soon turned Venus into an engineer's paradise. With power drawn from the planet's central heat, their huge electric ships bore steadily through the perennial monsoons and hurricanes, which also their aircraft treated with contempt. Islands were joined by tunnels and by millipede bridges. Every inch of land served some industrial or agricultural end. So successfully did the generations amass wealth that the rival races and rival castes were able to indulge, every few centuries, in vast revelries of mutual slaughter and material destruction without, as a rule, impoverishing their descendants. And so insensitive had man become that these orgies shamed him not at all. Indeed, only by the ardors of physical violence could this most Philistine species wrench itself for a while out of his complacency. Strife, which to nobler beings would have been a grave spiritual disaster, was for these a tonic, almost a religious exercise. These cathartic paroxysms, it should be observed, were but the rare and brief crisis which automatically punctuated ages of stolid peace. At no time did they threaten the existence of the species. Seldom did they even destroy its civilization. It was after a lengthy period of peace and scientific advancement that the eighth man made a startling astronomical discovery. Ever since the first man had learned that in the life of every star, there comes a critical moment when the great orb collapses, shrinking to a minute, dense grain with feeble radiation, man had periodically suspected that the sun was about to undergo this change and become a typical white dwarf. The eighth man detected sure signs of the catastrophe and predicted its fate. 20,000 years they gave themselves before the change should begin. In another 50,000 years, they guessed, Venus would probably be frozen and uninhabitable. The only hope was to migrate to Mercury during the Great Change, when that planet was already ceasing to be intolerably hot. It was necessary then to give Mercury an atmosphere, and to breed a new species which should be capable of adapting itself finally to a world of extreme cold. This desperate operation was already on foot when a new astronomical discovery rendered it futile. Astronomers detected, some distance from the solar system, a volume of non-luminous gas. Calculations showed that this object and the sun were approaching one another at a tangent, and that they would collide. Further calculation revealed the probable results of this event. The sun would flare up and expand prodigiously. Life would be quite impossible on any of the planets save, just possibly, Uranus, and more probably Neptune. The 3 planets beyond Neptune would escape roasting, but were unsuitable for other reasons. The 2 outermost would remain glacial, and moreover, lay beyond the range of the imperfect ether ships of the eighth man. The innermost was practically a ball globe of iron, devoid not merely of atmosphere and water, but also of the normal covering of rock. Neptune alone might be able to support life, but how could even Neptune be populated? Not only was its atmosphere very unsuitable, and its gravitational pull such as to make man's body an intolerable burden, but also up to the time of the collision, it would remain excessively cold. Not till after the collision could it support any kind of life known to man. How these difficulties were overcome, I have no time to tell, though the story of man's attack upon his final home is well worthy of recording. Nor can I tell in detail of the conflict of policy which now occurred. Some, realizing that the eighth man themselves could never live on Neptune, advocated an orgy of pleasure living till the end. But at length the race excelled itself in an almost ununanimous resolve to devote its remaining centuries to the production of a human being capable of carrying the torch of mentality into a new world. Either vessels were able to reach that remote world and set up chemical changes for the improvement of the atmosphere. It was also possible, by means of the lately rediscovered process of automatic annihilation of matter, to produce a constant supply of energy for the warming of an area where life might hope to survive until the sun should be rejuvenated. When at last the time for migration was approaching, a specially designed vegetation was shipped to Neptune and established in the warm area to fit it for man's use. Animals, it was decided, would be unnecessary. Subsequently, a specially designed human species, the ninth man, was transported to man's new home. The giant eighth man could not themselves inhabit Neptune. The trouble was not merely that they could scarcely support their own weight, let alone walk, but that the atmospheric pressure on Neptune was endurable, for the great planet bore a gaseous envelope thousands of miles deep. The solid globe was scarcely more than the yolk of a huge egg. The mass of the air itself combined with the mass of the solid to produce a gravitational pressure greater than that upon the Venerian ocean floor. The eighth man, therefore, dare not emerge from their ether ships to tread the surface of the planet, save for brief spells and steel diving suits. For them there was nothing else to do but to return to the archipelagos of Venus and make the best of life until the end. They were not spared for long. A few centuries after the settlement of Neptune had been completed, by transferring thither all the most precious material relics of humanity, the great planet itself narrowly missed collision with the dark stranger from space. Uranus and Jupiter were at the time well out of its track. Not so Saturn, which, a few years after Neptune's escape, was engulfed with all its rings and satellites. The sudden incandescence which resulted from this minor collision was but a prelude. The huge foreigner rushed on. Like a finger poked into a spider's web, it tangled up the planetary orbits. Having devoured its way through the asteroids, it missed Mars, caught Earth and Venus in its blazing hair, and leapt at the sun. Henceforth, the center of the solar system was a star nearly as wide as the old orbit of Mercury, and the system was transformed. Chapter 14. 1. Bird's Eye View. I have told man's story up to a point about halfway from his origin to his annihilation. Behind lies the vast span which includes the whole terrestrial and Venerian ages, with all their slow fluctuations of darkness and enlightenment. Ahead lies the Neptunian age, equally long, equally tragic perhaps, but more diverse, and in its last phase incomparably more brilliant. It would not be profitable to recount the history of man on Neptune on the scale of the preceding chronicle. Very much of it would be incomprehensible to terrestrials, and much of it repeats again and again in the many Neptunian modes, themes that we have already observed in the terrestrial or the Venerian movements of the human symphony. To appreciate fully the range and subtlety of the great living epic, we ought, no doubt, to dwell on its every movement with the same faithful care. But this is impossible to any human mind. We can but attend to significant phrases, here and there, and hope to capture some fragmentary hint of its vast, intricate form. And for the readers of this book, who are themselves tremors in the opening bars of the music, it is best that I should dwell chiefly on things near to them, even at the cost of ignoring much that is in fact greater. Before continuing our long flight, let us look around us. Hitherto we had passed over time's fields at a fairly low altitude, making many detailed observations. Now we shall travel at a greater height and with speed of a new order. We must therefore orientate ourselves within the wider horizon that opens around us. We must consider things from the astronomical rather than the human point of view. I said that we were halfway from man's beginning to his end. Looking back to that remote beginning, we see that the span of time which includes the whole career of the first man, from Pithecanthropus to the Patagonian disaster, is an unanalyzable point. Even the preceding and much longer period between the first mammal and the first man, some 25 millions of terrestrial years, seems now inconsiderable. The whole of it, together with the age of the first man, may be said to lie halfway between the formation of the planets 2,000 million years earlier and their final destruction 2,000 million years later. Taking a still wider view, we see that this eon of 4,000 million years is itself no more than a moment in comparison with the sun's age. And before the birth of the sun, the stuff of this galaxy had already endured for eons as a nebula. Yet even those eons look brief in relation to the passage of time before the myriad great nebulae themselves, the future galaxies, condensed out of the all-pervading mist in the beginning. Thus the whole duration of humanity, with as many sequent species and its incessant downpour of generations, is but a flash in the lifetime of the cosmos. Spatially, also, man is inconceivably minute. If in imagination we reduce this galaxy of ours to the size of an ancient terrestrial principality, we must suppose it adrift in the void with millions of other such principalities, very remote from one another. On the same scale, the all-embracing cosmos would bulk as a sphere, whose diameter was some 20 times greater than that of the lunar orbit in your day. And somewhere within the little wandering asteroid-like principality which is our own universe, the solar system would be an ultra-microscopic point, the greatest planet incomparably smaller. We have watched the fortunes of 8 successive human species for 1,000 million years, the first half of that flicker, which is the duration of man. 10 more species now succeed one another, or are contemporary, on the plains of Neptune. We, the last man, are the 18th man. Of the 8 pre-Neptunian species, some, as we have seen, remained always primitive. Many achieved at least a confused and fleeting civilization, and one, the brilliant 5th, was already awakening into true humanity when misfortune crushed it. The 10 Neptunian species show an even greater diversity. They range from the instinctive animal to modes of consciousness never before attained. The definitely subhuman degenerate types are confined mostly to the first 600 million years of man's sojourn on Neptune. During the earlier half of this long phase of preparation, man, at first almost crushed out of existence by a hostile environment, gradually peopled the huge north, but with beasts, not man. For man, as man, no longer existed. During the latter half of the preparatory 600 million years, the human spirit gradually woke again to undergo the fluctuating advance and decline characteristic of the pre-Neptunian ages. But subsequently, in the last 400 million years of his career on Neptune, man has made an almost steady progress toward full spiritual maturity. Let us now look rather more closely at these 3 great epochs of man's history. 2. Da Capo. It was in desperate haste that the last Venerian men had designed and fashioned the new species for the colonization of Neptune. The mere remoteness of the great planet, moreover, had prevented its nature from being explored at all thoroughly, and so the new human organism was but partially adapted to its destined environment. Inevitably, it was a dwarf type, limited in size by the necessity of resisting an excessive gravitation. Its brain was so cramped that everything but the bare essentials of humanity had to be omitted from it. Even so, the ninth men were too delicately organized to withstand the ferocity of natural forces on Neptune. This ferocity the designers had seriously underestimated, and so they were content merely to produce a miniature copy of their own type. They should have planned a hardy brute, lustily procreative, cunning in the struggle for physical existence, but above all tough, prolific, and so insensitive as to be scarcely worthy of the name man. They should have trusted that if once this crude seed could take root, natural forces themselves would in time conjure from it something more human. Instead, they produced a race cursed with the inevitable fragility of miniatures, and designed for a civilized environment which feeble spirits could not possibly maintain in a tumultuous world. For it so happened that the still youthful giant Neptune was slowly entering one of his phases of crustal shrinkage, and therefore of earthquake and eruption. Thus, the frail colonists found themselves increasingly in danger of being swallowed in sudden, fiery crevices or buried under volcanic dust. Moreover, their squat buildings, when not actually being trampled by lava streams or warped and cracked by their shifting foundations, were liable to be demolished by the battering ram thrust of a turbulent and massive atmosphere. Further, the atmosphere's unwholesome composition killed all possibility of cheerfulness and courage in a race whose nature was doomed to be, even in favorable circumstances, neurotic. Fortunately, this agony could not last indefinitely. Little by little, civilization crumbled into savagery, the torturing vision of better things was lost, men's consciousness was narrowed and coarsened into brute consciousness. By good luck, the brute precariously survived. Long after the ninth man had fallen from man's estate, nature herself, in her own slow and blundering manner, succeeded where man had failed. The brute descendants of this human species became at length well adapted to their world. In time, there arose a wealth of subhuman forms in the many kinds of environment afforded by the lands and seas of Neptune. None of them penetrated far toward the equator, for the swollen sun had rendered the tropics at this time far too hot to support life of any kind. Even at the pole, the protracted summer put a great strain on all but the most hardy creatures. Neptune's year was at this time about 165 times the length of the old terrestrial year. The slow seasonal change had an important effect on life's own rhythms. All but the most ephemeral organisms tended to live through at least one complete year, and the higher mammals survived longer. At a much later stage, this natural longevity was to play a great and beneficial part in the revival of man. But, on the other hand, the increasing sluggishness of individual growth, the length of immaturity in each generation, retarded the natural evolutionary process on Neptune, so that compared with the terrestrial and Venerian epochs, the biological story now moves at a snail's pace. After the fall of the ninth man, the subhuman creatures had one and all adopted a quadruped habit, the better to cope with gravity. At first they had indulged merely in occasional support from their knuckles, but in time many species of true quadrupeds had appeared. In several of the running types, the fingers, like the toes, had grown together, and a hoof had developed, not on the old fingertips, which were bent back and atrophied, but on the knuckles. 200 million years after the solar collision, innumerable species of subhuman grazers with long sheep-like muscles, ample molars, and almost ruminant digestive systems were competing with one another on the polar continent. Upon these preyed the subhuman carnivora, of whom some were built for speed in the chase, others for stalking and a sudden spring. But since jumping was no easy matter on Neptune, the cat-like types were all minute. They preyed upon man's more rabbit-like and rat-like descendants, or on the carrion of the larger mammals, or on the lusty worms and beetles. These had sprung originally from vermin, which had been transported accidentally from Venus. For of all the ancient Venerian fauna, only man himself, a few insects and other invertebrates, and many kinds of microorganisms succeeded in colonizing Neptune. Of plants, many types had been artificially bred for the New World, and from these eventually arose a host of grasses, flowering plants, thick trunk bushes, and novel seaweeds. On these, marine flora fed certainly highly developed marine worms, and of these last, some in time became vertebrate, predatory, swift, and fish-like. On these in turn man's own marine descendants preyed, whether as subhuman seals or still more specialized subhuman porpoises. Perhaps most remarkably of these developments of the ancient human stock was that which led, through a small insectivorous bat-like glider, to a great diversity of true flying mammals, scarcely larger than hummingbirds, but in some cases agile as swallows. Nowhere did the typical human form survive. There were only beasts, fitted by structure and instinct to some niche or other of their infinitely diverse and roomy world. Certainly, strange vestiges of human mentality did indeed persist here and there, even as, in the forelimbs of most species, there still remain buried the relics of man's once cunning fingers. For instance, There were certain grazers which in times of hardship would meet together and give tongue in cacophonous ululation, or sitting on their haunches with forelimbs pressed together, they would listen by the hour to the howls of some leader, responding intermittently with groans and whimpers, working themselves at last into foaming madness. And there were carnivora which, in the midst of the springtime fervor, would suddenly cease from love-making, fighting, and the daily routine of hunting, to sit alone in some high place day after day, night after night, watching, waiting, until at last hunger forced them into action. Now in the fullness of time, about 300 million terrestrial years after the solar collision, a certain minute, hairless, rabbit-like creature, scampering on the polar grasslands, found itself greatly persecuted by a swift hound from the south. The subhuman rabbit was relatively unspecialized and had no effective means of defense or flight. It was almost exterminated. A few individuals, however, saved themselves by taking to the dense and thick-trunk scrub, whither the hound could not follow them. Here they had to change their diet and manner of life, deserting grass for roots, berries, and even worms and beetles. Their forelimbs were now increasingly used for digging and climbing, and eventually for weaving nests of stick and straw. In this species, the fingers had never grown together. Internally, the forepaw was like a minute clenched fist from the elongated and exposed knuckles, of which separate toes protruded. And now the knuckles elongated themselves still further, becoming in time a new set of fingers. Within the palm of the new little monkey hand there still remained traces of man's ancient fingers, bent in upon themselves. As of old, manipulation gave rise to clear percipience, and this, in conjunction with the necessity of frequent experiments in diet, hunting, and defense, produced at length a real versatility of behavior and suppleness of mind. The rabbit throve, adopted an almost upright gait, continued to increase in stature and in brain. Yet just as the new hand was not merely a resurrection of the old hand, so the new regions of the brain were no mere revival of the atrophied human cerebrum, but a new organ, which overlaid and swallowed up that ancient relic. The creature's mind, therefore, was in many respects a new mind, though molded to the same great basic needs. Like his forerunners, of course, he craved food, love, glory, companionship. In pursuit of these ends, he devised weapons and traps, and built wicker villages. He held powwows. He became the 10th man. Three, slow conquest. For 1,000,000 terrestrial years, these long-armed, hairless beings were spreading their wicker huts and bone implements over the great northern continents, and for many more millions they remained in possession without making further cultural progress. For evolution, both biological and cultural, was indeed slow on Neptune. At last the 10th men were attacked by a microorganism and demolished. From the ruins several primitive human species developed and remained isolated in remote territories for millions of decades, until at length chance of enterprise brought them into contact. One of these early species, crouched and tusked, was persistently trapped for its ivory by an abler type till it was exterminated. Another, long of muscle and large of base, habitually squatted on his haunches like the kangaroo. Shortly after this industrial and social species had discovered the use of the wheel, a more primitive but more warlike type crashed into it like a tidal wave and overwhelmed it. Erect, but literally almost as broad as they were tall, these chunkish and bloody-minded savages spread over the whole Arctic and subarctic region and spent some millions of years in monotonous reiteration of progress and decline, until at last a slow decay of their germplasm almost ended man's career. Give me a second. We'll talk about this later, this part. But after an eon of darkness, there appeared another thick-set but larger-brained species. This, for the first time on Neptune, conceived the religion of love, and all those spiritual cravings and agonies which had flickered in man so often and so vainly upon Earth and Venus. there appeared again feudal empires, militant nations, economic class wars, and not once but often a world state covering the whole northern hemisphere. These men it was that first crossed the equator in artificially cooled electric ships and explored the huge south. No life of any kind was discovered in the southern hemisphere, for even in that age no living matter could have crossed the roasting tropics without artificial refrigeration. Indeed, it was only because the sun's temporary revival had already passed its zenith that even man, with all his ingenuity, could endure a long tropical voyage. Like the first man, and so many other natural human types, these 14th men were imperfectly human. Like the first man, they conceived ideals of conduct, which their imperfectly organized nervous systems could never attain and seldom approach. Unlike the first man, they survived with but minor biological changes for 300 million years. But even so long a period did not enable them to transcend their imperfect spiritual nature. Again and again and again, they passed from savagery to world civilization and back to savagery. They were captive within their own nature, as a bird in a cage. And as a caged bird may fumble with nest-building materials and periodically destroy the fruit of his aimless toil, so these cramped beings destroy their civilizations. At length, however, the second phase of Neptunian history, this era of fluctuation, was brought to an end. At the close of the 600 million years after the first settlement of the planet, unaided nature produced, in the 15th human species, the highest form of natural man which she had produced only once before, in the second species. And this time no Martians interfered. We must not stay to watch the struggle of this great-headed man to overcome his one serious handicap, excessive weight of cranium and unwieldy proportions of body. Suffice it that after a long drawn-out immaturity, including one great mechanized war between the northern and southern hemispheres, the 15th man outgrew the ailments and fantasies of youth and consolidated themselves as a single world community. This civilization was based economically on volcanic power and spiritually on devotion to the fulfillment of human capacity. It was this species which, for the first time on Neptune, conceived as an enduring racial purpose the will to remake human nature upon an ampler scale. Henceforth, in spite of many disasters, such as another period of earthquake and eruption, sudden climatic changes, innumerable plagues and biological aberrations, human progress was relatively steady. It was not by any means swift and sure. There were still to be ages, often longer than the whole career of the first man, in which the human spirit would rest from his pioneering to consolidate his conquests, or would actually stray into the wilderness. But never again, seemingly, was it to be routed and crushed into mere animality. In tracing man's final advance to full humanity, we can observe only the broadest features of a whole astronomical era. But in fact, it is an era crowded with many thousands of long-lived generations. Myriads of individuals, each one unique, live out their lives in rapt intercourse with one another, contribute their heart's pulses to the universal music, and presently vanish, giving place to others. All this age-long sequence of private living, which is the actual tissue of humanity's flesh, I cannot describe. I can only trace, as it were, the disembodied form of his growth. The 15th man first set themselves to abolish 5 great evils, namely disease, suffocating toil, senility, misunderstanding, ill will. The story of their devotion, their many disastrous experiments and ultimate triumph, cannot here be told, nor can I recount how they learned and used the secret of deriving power from the annihilation of matter, nor how they invented either ships for the exploration of neighboring planets, nor how, after ages of experiments, they design and produce a new species, the 16th, to supersede themselves. The new type was analogous to the ancient 5th, which had colonized Venus. Artificial rigid atoms had been introduced into its bone tissues, so that it might support great stature and an ample brain, in which, moreover, an exceptionally fine-grained cellular structure permitted a new complexity of organization. telepathy also was once more achieved, not by means of the Martian units, which had long ago become extinct, but by the synthesis of new molecular groups of similar type, partly through the immense increase of mutual understanding, which resulted from telepathic rapport, partly through improved coordination of the nervous system. The ancient evil of selfishness was entirely and finally abolished from the normal human being. Egoistic impulses, whenever they refused to be subordinated, were henceforth classed as symptoms of insanity. The sensory powers of the new species were of course greatly improved, and he was even given a pair of eyes in the back of the head. Henceforth man was to have a circular instead of a semicircular field of vision. And such was the general intelligence of the new race that many problems formerly deemed insoluble were now solved in a single flash of insight. Of the great practical uses to which the 16th men put their powers, one only need be mentioned as an example. They gained control of the movement of their planet. Early in their career, they were able, with the unlimited energy at their disposal, to direct it into a wider orbit, so that its average climate became more temperate, as snow occasionally covered the polar regions. But as the ages advanced and the sun became steadily less ferocious, it became necessary to reverse this process and shift the planet gradually nearer to the sun. When they had possessed their world for nearly 50 million years, the 16th man, like the 5th before them, learned to enter into past minds. For them, this was a more exciting adventure than for their forerunners, since they were still ignorant of terrestrial and Venerian history. Like their forerunners, so dismayed were they at the huge volume of eternal mystery in the past, that for a while, in spite of their own great blessings and spontaneous gaiety, existence seemed a mockery. But in time, they came to regard the past's mystery as a challenge. They told themselves that the past was calling to them for help, and that somehow they must prepare a great crusade to liberate the past. How this was to be done they could not conceive, but they were determined to bear in mind this quixotic aim in the great enterprise, which had by now become the chief concern of the race, namely the creation of a human type of an altogether higher order. It had become clear that man had by now advanced in understanding and creativeness as far as was possible to the individual human brain, acting in physical isolation. Yet the 16th men were oppressed by their own impotence. Though in philosophy they had delved further than had ever before been possible, yet even at their deepest they found only the shifting sands of misery. In particular, they were haunted by three ancient problems, two of which were purely intellectual, namely the mystery of time and the mystery of mind's relation to the world. Their third problem was the need somehow to reconcile their confirmed loyalty to life, which they conceive as embattled against death, with their ever-strengthening impulse to rise above the battle and admire it dispassionately. Age after age, the races of the 16th man blossomed with culture after culture. The movement of thought ranged again and again through all the possible modes of the spirit, ever discovering new significance in ancient themes. Yet throughout this epoch, the three great problems remained unsolved, perplexing the individual and vitiating the policy of the race. Forced thus at length to choose between spiritual stagnation and a perilous leap in the dark, the 16th man determined to set about devising a type of brain which, by means of the mental fusion of many individuals, might awaken into an altogether new mode of consciousness. Thus, it was hoped, man might gain insight into the very heart of existence, whether finally to admire or loathe. And thus the racial purpose, which had been so much confused by the philosophical ignorance, might at last become clear. Of the 100 million years which passed before the 16th man produced the new human type, I must not pause to tell. They thought they had achieved their heart's desire, but in fact the glorious beings which they had produced were tortured by subtle imperfections beyond their maker's comprehension. Consequently, no sooner had these 17th men peopled the world and attained full cultural stature, than they also bent all the strength to the production of a new type, essentially like their own, but perfected. Thus, after a brief career of a few 100,000 years, crowded with splendor and agony. The 17th gave place to the 18th, and as it turns out, the last human species. Since all the earlier cultures find their fulfillment in the world of the last man, I pass over them to enlarge somewhat upon our modern age. And that right there is where we leave it for today, Tajigen. We're still gonna talk about a lot of things still. The reading itself, we leave there in chapter 14. A cliffhanger again, as we're about to see the 18th man, and mostly it's gonna be about their culture. We've already made it to the very last man. Yeah, last and first man, from the first to the last. Today, we made it from the 5th to the 18th already. Now, there are a few passages we must talk about first. We remain at this screen, we remain with this overlay, this background ambience. First, I need to look something up. So the first passage I highlighted. Highlight sounds right to me, it sounds like a right way to say it. The first passage to highlight was about the 3 planets beyond Neptune. The 3 planets beyond Neptune would escape roasting, but were unsuitable for other reasons. The 2 outermost would remain glacial and moreover lay beyond the range of the imperfect ether ships of the 8th man. The innermost was practically a ball globe of iron. I think that's Pluto is talking about. Devoid not merely of atmosphere and water, but also the normal covering of rock. 1930 is the date this book was published. Pluto would not be declared a planet. Actually, it was that same year it got declared, but like, you know, it was written before the year itself. I don't know which part of the year was published. No way Stapledon would be able to modify that to add Pluto if it even was relevant. Even, I think mentioning it by name would have been that. And he called them planets because the concept of a dwarf planet is something that only came about 20 years ago, 2006 I think it was, when Pluto, the whole debacle with Pluto and Eris and the other planets in the Kuiper belt, things like that. Other planets were already discovered to an extent. They weren't considered part of the solar system, I think, but I was kind of surprised to see that for a moment because I forgot this little part. The 3 planets beyond Neptune, it says. So, let me look up. Let me look up things like the trans-Neptunian objects, the Kuiper belt, things like that. Yeah, like I think Pluto is still the closest, right? 2006 is when they changed the whole thing. I think Eris immediately comes after. The thing is, okay, Makemake Haumea also there. I'm looking at just like the AI Google result, but it may not be accurate. But what I don't remember is whether Eris was like immediately after Pluto, or even if Pluto was immediately after Neptune, right there. Sorry, just checking these things here. Let me see. We must assume that the 3 planets being talked about are Pluto, Eris, and Makemake or Haumea as the 3rd one, let's say. The 2 outermost will remain glacial. Eris and Makemake or Haumea again. The ether ships, the 8th man, yeah. That was when the 8th men were trying to find a place, yeah. We're going back to like the 8th man thing. The innermost was practically a ball globe of iron. When you look at Pluto, the image of Pluto itself, that seems to describe it. Devoid not merely of atmosphere and water, but also of the normal covering of rock. Even right now in 2026, that seems to describe it. Yeah, because we have the Kuiper belt. Yeah. Pluto, Eris, Haumea, and Makemake are official. I hope I'm saying the name of some of those right. Are official dwarf planets. They differ from the 8 major planets because they have not cleared their orbital neighborhoods. There was also Gong Gong. Oh, there's a wiki for like the solar system. The solar system wiki was one of the results. Interesting. What is this? I'm seeing Hyperion, Brahma, and Vishnu. Is this? What is this? Brahma, Vishnu, but like Oceanus, hypothetical planet. No, this is something different. Oh, there's a planet named Hades, so it's like separate from Pluto in that way. Planet 10, supposedly. These are different things entirely. And then the hypothetical planet X. And then there's Setna even far beyond, but we're going beyond. We're talking about other things entirely. One has to assume that those 3 planets, even a couple of them unnamed at the time. I think Pluto wasn't even named at the time, whether it was considered a planet or not. Again, the concept of dwarf planet doesn't even exist then, I think. which still surprises me, all things considered. But yeah, just goes to show you how far-reaching Stapledon is in his vision, not just in like the astronomy side, but the evolutionary side. I do wish I would get more into science stuff, you know, the more mathematical side of things, that is. I've talked about this throughout the streams this week, actually. Quite a bit throughout the streams this week, and whew, man, it's been a wonderful week. I'm glad we were able to give all that time, even with stuff going on, to F14, to Legend CA. That's the way it's meant to be every week, or most weeks. Not that Balatro wasn't important either. No story there. Well, we always are telling a story every stream. That's the beauty of the live streamer. The entertainer like me. And there's nobody like me though. Like Loki said in the Avengers, there are no men like me. There are always men like you. Said the old man. Not with that voice. There are always men like you. Something like that. But anyway, I'm going on a tangent because I get to like nerd out or get maniacal about all that. Of course, this kind of thing calls out to me. I love this. Let's go for an entirely different passage. Let's talk about, so it skipped over some of those humanities that could barely be called humanities super quickly. The Ninth Man, barely able to adapt to Neptune, created by the Eighth Man. Something that struck me as I read this was that I always pictured the Ninth Man as like being created, and like they wake up for the first time ever, let's say, for the most part, on Neptune. And Venus they only know by like technology that the Eighth Man gave them or something. But no, they must have like walked on Venus for a while, talked with the Eighth Man, all of that, like, you are the successors to the human race, and boom, they were there. So like they were colonists in some ways. The big difference is that when we saw the transition from the Fifth Man to Venus, the Fifth Men themselves colonized it. And eventually de-evolution and evolution had to happen because they could barely adapt to it. It was miraculous even that they were able to live there for a while. Presumably for like millions of years, or who knows how long. But the Ninth Man were separate from the Eighth Man. I always like to believe that when we have these artificial creations, these artificial ones going on, they're using their own DNA, their own cells, so that essentially many of those creations are their children, you know? There is descendants, and there is biological DNA descendants. You can trace all the way back to Homo sapiens, and even Pithecanthropus, as we saw right there, right? Pithecanthropus. It reminds me of something I read also in another book called Number 9 Dream by David Mitchell. I want to get more into his literature. Cloud Atlas had, well, I was going to say around this time last year. No, it was like very early, even earlier, in January 2025 or so. I had a great time reading that. But anyway, we got to the 10th Man, which were like rabbit-like things. Well, at first they were described like that. I am picturing them like little rabbits that are a bit more humanoid, kind of grotesque looking in that sense, but, you know, they were not quite like that. That's the whole point. Some of that description goes over my head still, especially as I'm reading it out loud, but eventually they get destroyed by a microorganism. The 11th Man, the 12th Man, the 13th Man, they don't even get called that, but it's those that are described in this paragraph I'm about to reread. From the ruins, so at last the 10th Men were attacked by a microorganism and demolished. From the ruins, several primitive human species developed and remained isolated in remote territories for millions of decades until at length chance of enterprise brought them into contact. What is important to mention here is like what they were mentioning at the start of the Neptune section. Some of these are contemporary with each other. So they didn't evolve one from the previous one, they evolved from different ones. If you look at the Wikipedia entry, for example, for Last and First Man, there's barely any mention of like the 11th through 13th Man. I feel like I maybe want to even edit the freaking article or have or suggest an edit so that more details are added, because you can literally just add this paragraph and it's not too long and it's long enough and it describes more details about them. But these are, okay, so let's see. One of these early species, crouched and tusked, was persistently trapped for its ivory by an abler type till it was exterminated. That's it. It's one sentence. That's the 11th Man right there. That's the 11th Man. One sentence. Because we had the bird's eye view thing explained by the narrator, the author, Neptunian 18th Man, author of the book. And you know, we go through it fast. We go through it even faster now. Another long of muscle and large of base, habitually squatted on his haunches like the kangaroo. Shortly after this industrious and social species had discovered the use of the wheel, a more primitive but more warlike type crashed into it like a tidal wave and overwhelmed it. That one that discovered the use of the wheel, that's the 12th man, kangaroo-like, kind of squatted on his haunches. I don't think it was hopping around like a kangaroo necessarily, it's just like something kind of like that. Longer muscle and larger base. Larger base does make it sound like a kangaroo though. Those were the 12th men. And the 13th man is that primitive but more warlike type. Erect, but literally almost as broad as they were tall, these chunkish and bloody-minded savages spread over the whole Arctic and subarctic region and spent some millions of years in monotonous reiteration of progress and decline until at last the slow decay of their germplasm almost ended man's career. It is important to note that, as it says that, because of what it said about the 14th man, like a paragraph after this, this progress and decline, it never reaches like even like Iron Age, Stone Age, I think. Barely goes into Stone Age civilization, I think, is the whole point of this. That's the thing. And so, yeah, I mean, it only tells you so much right there. It only tells you so much. It only tells you a little bit. It tells you everything it needs to tell you, actually, for these. But like, no, sorry, I wasn't quite saying what I wanted to say from my train of thought there. No, yeah, millions of years just being Neanderthal, Pithecanthropus. They don't describe what these look like, these chunkish savages or whatever. They're just very tall and broad. I've seen most depictions of them be ape-like, you know, like that early kind of human. They probably were very different though. Something tells me maybe they were very different, but who knows. But yeah, they just like killed the 12th man, and these were the 13th man. 13th man. In some ways, lucky number 13 for them. In some ways, unlucky. And after that, the ones after them, those were indeed the 14th man. Actually, doing civilizations pretty much like the first man, like Homo sapiens, like us, like you. And like the 6th man. I think the implication is that they indeed went through like theocracies, Roman empires, Greek empires, equivalents of that, I mean. Feudal ages, medieval ages, Iron Ages, Bronze Ages with collapses maybe, things like that. I gotta read more about the Bronze Age collapse. The whole thing sounds fascinating because it's very, very much the apocalypse in many ways. I underestimated like what that was meant to be in human history, truly. And that was even, that's before like the Roman Empire and all that, right? And it sucks because at the time something is going on in like the Americas, or America, however you prefer it. I switch between both words, both terms, I guess. I guess saying America in this case is like saying Eurasia, you know, which is not wrong either. Just you're covering a much vaster scale, but there's things going on there too, and it's just it's lost to history because people burned books. You shouldn't have done that. And we're seeing the burning of books even in some civilizations here. Some things get lost, some knowledge gets lost, some ignorance happens, things like that. Even to the 5th man that happened. They got some ignorance, and that's what you have to remember. Something that was stated much earlier in the book. A lot of this glosses over a lot of facts. It's not just the bird's eye view thing. Like, a lot of this happens over a long, gradual period. They have been saying millions of years this, millions of years that. Some cases thousands of years, all of that, even for long-lived species. But like, no, we're still talking about something that happens very gradually. The whole thing with the 7th man, the 8th man, the transition, all of that, is also very gradual. That's the thing. Now, let's talk about something entirely different. Something I talk about all the bloody time. Konnichigen Ohayo Gokaimasu is your favorite superstar, Maniac, the multi-dimensional Tajigen Khaiden, a sentient star cluster, and many cosmic minds combined in VTuber V-Singer form, or like I used to have the longer intro, we are many cosmic minds combined to form a single entity on a higher plane of existence. It is very important to note, I've been saying it over and over, and I will never stop saying it, I think, though I'm finding better ways to phrase it, hopefully, because I feel like I don't make myself clear about what the hell that means, and that passage, that last passage I highlight, helps with that a little bit. We'll see that in even greater detail in the coming chapters on the next reading stream for this. But it is not a hive mind. It does not make the individual lesser for for expanding into a group mind. It is not a mind also that is like a Dragon Ball fusion, in which Vegito is greater than Vegeta and Kakaroto, but it's at the expense of the two of them. They don't get lost like a hive mind either, but they are not there. They are there. Their individuality can only lead to this, but also you're not gonna see Vegeta himself only anymore. You're not gonna see just Goku himself anymore. You know, no, it's gonna be Vegito and Vegito only, and at the end you are only left with a joined mind. If you wanna just, I don't know, talk with Vegeta, say Vegito, hey, could you behave and talk like Vegeta right now, just for this moment, and tap only into Vegeta's experiences and memories, which are yours because you are Vegeta as well. He can't do that, not really. At least that's the understanding I did. It is not that. One is able to tap into the individual mind like that in some way, right? It is not like the Martian mind, which expanded into a group mind, but expanded only in body mass, which is still amazing, it's still great, it still does a lot of amazing things, but still not quite it. Still not quite it. So, I kind of did it in the middle of it, but imagine an ellipsis between brackets as I say this. And then the rest of the text. About devising a type of brain which, by means of the mental fusion of many individuals, might waken into an altogether new mode of consciousness. This is the 16th man creating the 17th man. Thus, it was hoped man may gain insight into the very heart of existence, whether finally to admire or loathe, and thus the racial purpose which had been so much confused by philosophical ignorance might at last become clear. The mental fusion of many individuals, awakening into an altogether new mode of consciousness. Stapledon is in love with this concept, and therefore so am I, and therefore he's my favorite author. Last and First Man, in the few remaining chapters, because there's very few left now. There's actually only 2 left, and well, the epilogue. In a way, there's 3 chapters left. It's gonna introduce more of that with the 18th man. They have something like that going on. We can already say that because there's only the 18th man left. We got to them, and we're about to read more about them and also finish the story here, in many ways. But just want to show you, like, things skip over super quickly. Less and less detail for each of these things, but like, it's the way it's gotta be. It still gives you a lot. It still gives you a lot. And also because a lot of it is just incomprehensible to a first human mind, so to speak. But yeah. To a Homo sapiens, right? See, the species is called Homo sapiens because they gain sapiens, you know, like the word sapiens that ends in CE, not in S. But it's like, it's notable that it achieved that because the others hadn't quite achieved that. Just like Homo erectus is called that because it's able to be erect instead of hunched, right? It's the most amazing achievement it's able to do. So, to a Homo sapiens, being erect instead of hunched, except when I don't have a posture check. Yeah, that's my posture check. I literally am checking my posture as I do that. That's like a posture check redeemed. But you know, it's like a fundamental thing. It's like, to the earlier species, that's a great achievement. But to Homo sapiens, that's like, it just happens, you know? It's just, okay, yeah, but we have great things going on. You have to assume the others, sapiens is just the basics at this point. There's greater things, and they maybe are incomprehensible to Homo sapiens, right? Something like that. But yeah, that thing that is gonna be introduced with the 18th man about fusion of many individuals and all that. Again, the fusion is there, but as it will be made clear, maybe I am kind of forgetting it and it's not quite how I'm saying, but I think mostly it is. That it's going to be important that the individual is not lost, and even you can tap into the individual while tapping into the group mind both at the same time. It's like multi-existence in that way, and that's what makes it so freaking cool. I contain multitudes, I am many people at once. Just doing this. That's the whole lore with Khaiden Tajigen. That's the whole lore. Many of those are many iterations of Khaiden as well, as you see in FF14, as you see in Pokemon Legend CA, Pokemon Violet, even that has its own variations. And I don't mean when I change my race and all that, no, like I live in many different dimensions and universes and I perceive all of them at once. Oh yes, it can get very busy, but the mind upgrades itself to be able to do that, is the idea. I digress though. We'll see just a glimpse of that concept from Stapledon, though, because Star Maker is the one that does more of that. But we'll see at least quite a bit of that in Last and First Man here in the coming chapters. And that leads me to my next point. I think if it all goes according to Keikaku, according to plan, the next live reading stream will be the last one. I think this is the 4th. Are we in the 4th? 5 streams to read the whole thing is not bad at all. Yeah, we started at a pace of 4 chapters, but this pace is a lot better for me, like this. 3 chapters, 3 hours, basically. Let's talk about it, shall we? Back to this, that's the screen right here. Let me reposition myself. Alright. We have so it's 16 chapters in the epilogue. We just finished chapter 14. 15 is next, so 15, 16, the epilogue. I like that they're subdivided into sections, which are, in a way, sub-chapters. I like that way of doing it. If I ever write something, I think I want to do it that way. So you'll see a book that doesn't have like 20-something chapters, maybe a neat number like 12 or 16 like that, right? Not counting prologues, epilogues, maybe interludes, right? But you know, it's gonna have sub-chapters within the chapters. For some reason, something about the structure just like gives me dopamine. I don't know if that's the way to say it, but something pushes my buttons about that I love so much. Something about the structure. Oh, structure can be fun. Formula can be fun. I don't mean mathematical formula. I mean formula like, oh, predictive. This is predictable in a way, but in a good way. Mathematical formula is good to learn too, though. We're talking about formula. Maybe I am indeed an alchemist, a writer, a scholar, an alchemist. I gotta get back and doing crafting for alchemy. Yeah, we're gonna talk about the schedule this coming week because I'm not sure what we're gonna do for F14. There's something going on with that is very important to point out. But before that, though, yeah, the next Last and First Man live reading stream will be the last one. There will be that reading, but there will also be quite a bit of yapping at the end. I am guessing that whatever it is I'm gonna talk about, like some of the things we already talked about in this post-reading yapping, it's not going to cover everything I want to talk about regarding that book, but I guess we can talk about it in future streams, not related to it as well, and all that. But alright, yes, let's talk about the schedule for this coming week. Expect much of the same. I actually don't know what we're doing on Thursday. There's a small possibility there's no stream on Thursday either, but we'll see. Thursday, then Friday. Friday, March 27, Saturday, March 28, Sunday, March 29. This coming week, otherwise, is as expected. Final Fantasy Friday, Story Saturday with Legend CA, where I don't think it's gonna be the last Legend CA Mega Dimension stream, and overall the last Legend CA stream, but it might actually be the last stream. It's gonna be stream number 20 overall for Legend CA, and the 6th for Mega Dimension. But you know, the post-game and all that. It's either the last or the second to last one, depending on what we do and the length and all that, but it might work really well if it's the last one, because the week after this week, or this coming week, depending on how you see it, the last full week of March, because the week after is just 1 or 2 days of March, and then April starts. The streams that week will be special. So Final Fantasy Friday, as we've seen it, Pokemon being there on Saturday, Sunday, whatever we're doing after Last and First Man ends as well, we're not gonna do that. I want to dedicate a couple special karaokes, so I'm kind of low-key announcing it already, to Kamen Rider and Super Sentai respectively on their days. Well, not in Japanese time, maybe I should base it on Japanese time, but it won't be based on that. And we're setting up a collab with Luren before that, but April 3rd is a Friday. That's the anniversary for Kamen Rider. I want to do a karaoke as we've done in previous years. Sunday, I want to do a karaoke for Super Sentai, mostly the openings, not many more songs, but Rider we have other songs that are not openings or endings. There's a few endings of Sentai I've known by now, but I've been listening to a ton of the Super Sentai openings, most if not all of them, so I've learned quite a few of them, mostly the old school ones. They're also kind of easier for me to sing. Some of those, like, man, I wish I could sing the King Oger opening. It's so freaking good, but it's a difficult one. Not just the voice, the range, but also the freaking fluidity is insane, but such a great song. So well done by the singer. I don't remember the name right now, or the band, but yeah. Thus that week is gonna be devoted to those streams. In fact, all of FF4, the only thing we're gonna see for FF14 for that week. Can you tell I'm kind of talking as if I was written by Olaf Stapledon? I'm talking with like the way I phrase things kind of is the way it's phrased in the book. It's the influence of reading it, but I think it's something that has remained with me for a long time. Thus, I need to keep rereading it, you know? I'm maybe using this at a rate hitherto unknown. The phrasing from that book, you know? Something like that. Honestly, I'm all for it. I'm all for it, for talking permanently like this. I want to keep doing that. But no, thus that week, you know, will be devoid of F14 except for the collab with Alluring. So no like Shadowbringers story and all that. Here's the thing we need to talk about with F14. There are a couple of things incoming. I saw the information yesterday after the stream. I am so glad we did finish all the Either Current quests. Oh, actually, I still need to synchronize to the Either Currents themselves to actually fly everywhere in the zones, but the quest lines that come from the Either Currents and all that, some of them even leading to Beast Stripes, Allied Societies, I mean, very soon in the post-patches, which we're not going to start yet. Before the post-patches happen, the biggest things that are coming, first of all, are 2 dungeons that are optional. We gotta do them. Academia and Neither is one of them. I already got the slight spoiler that that's what it is. I need to know actually, because I need to know where to get the quest that unlocks that. Where to get the quest that unlocks that. And I have forgotten this was also done with Omega, and I think it's done with just every patch. It wasn't in 5.1 that they introduced the first part of the normal raid series, which are gonna be 4 of them, and it's gonna be very extensive. In terms of like the lore being introduced in there, the time taken to do it. It's 4 raids you gotta do. It's a series of 4 of them, as we've done before. Promises to be another long stream, you know? Let's keep doing it for as long as we can. We did 10 hours last Friday. They don't look like they will continue, sadly, because of Scuff that cut the VOD off, so I'm really hoping that doesn't happen again. I disabled the GeForce experience, not that there was anything heavy going on. I didn't have the thing that enables, you know, that makes it so that the screen gets recorded, so that you hit a button and the last 5 minutes are recorded. That used to be a thing that here and there caused me issues, but no, it's been disabled since a long time. It has to be manually enabled. But I had something that allows screenshots. I need to find another way to do screenshots again, because I don't know, maybe that wasn't even the issue, but I had to be on the safe side, I don't know. But what was I saying? That's a big major thing. So I want to do them in the same stream, the 2 dungeons, and well, all the lore and story and the unlocks and all that comes from that, and the normal raid series that is about to come up. I think I can already say the name. It's Eden. I know the name is Eden. I don't know the details about it, but I mean, given the whole Xenator stuff, I don't think it's gonna be exactly a paradise, is it? But Eden, it involves Rin. It involves that little cliffhanger we saw at the end of the story with Tancred and Rin looking over the feeling something going on out there. Yeah, something like that. Otherwise, I don't know what we're about to see, though. But Eden, and you know, especially when you start unlocking it for the first time, there's something very extensive. We had a great time in Omega, hearing Nero's music again, that Imperial music that we didn't hear since ARR. It has a lot of single-player content, a lot of the times in between the raids and things like that, that is important to talk about, that is important to do and give good time to and good space to. Thus, the length of that stream might be a long one again, also as we'll do the dungeons. There's a small possibility maybe the dungeons are in their own stream, but that's one thing I wanted to do before 5.1. The other thing may not have to be before 5.1, but I actually wanted to be ambitious enough to get all my crafters and gatherers, there's only, well, it's Botanist and Fisher for gatherer, no miner, not for now, to level 80. And then all in one stream, maybe, do the Crystalline Mean quest lines for those. They're already in level 80, so like I don't need to be leveling up in the middle of it and all that. And ideally, that is done before we do the big dungeons and raids and all that, but we're gonna have to do it in reverse. So I think most likely this Friday, we have a big thing, this freaking Final Fantasy Friday, before F14 for that takes a 1 week hiatus, so to speak. I mean, we'll still have it if it all goes as planned with the collab with Alluring for the Easter event, but at the same time, it won't be like the Shadowbringer stuff we're doing. I may even stream myself like doing the bar leveling up I've been trying to do, or even this crafting leveling up, not the actual Crystalline Mean stuff, or even doing Eureka or some other grinding or something. Hell, I might need to do it on a stream because apparently I can't find time off the stream. I'm gonna see if I can log in later today. Today is a busy day that I want to start dedicating to preparing things for the week ahead. I've been trying to make that be a thing I do and all that, but ADHD just goes too hard on me, and the problem with doing that is work I end up doing on the weekdays themselves, and like I would prefer it if it's already all prepared on Sunday, to keep a long story short. And things that, some of those things are like technically optional. I don't necessarily need to do them, but in a way it's a necessity for better mental health or for better organization of things, so that everything flows a lot smoother, you know? Things like that. Or as we've seen in Last and First Man, maybe some things such as mental health and art, nah, they're necessities. They're not just luxurious things and all that. They become necessities. They are necessities. The universe demands it. That's how it is. But yeah, I think the way it's gonna go, my thinking right now, this may change in terms of plans or what I've been able to do, but it will give me more time for the crystalline mean ambition and the crafting ambition and all that. What I think we're gonna do is we're gonna have this Friday a big thing with those 2 dungeons. So hey, Superstar Squad, anybody that wants to join me, think about it this Friday, which again is most likely gonna be the thing. 70% sure, though. Stay tuned for the schedule for that. But yeah, it will be a big thing like that. Probably a very long stream as a result. And the week after that, this is talking just about FF14. With Alluring collab, not really advancing that. Then the week after that, which is the week that runs from Monday to Sunday, from April 6th to April 12th, we are back to Shadowbringers, but we're in the Crystalline Mean. And then the week after that, from April 13th to 19th, probably on Friday 17th, we start the patch. We start the post patches for it, which is gonna be probably 1/2 of 5.1 if we can. Either the MSQ or the other non-MSQ things, of which there's a lot of group content. Alliance raids, I think, begin. Nier Automata, baby. Yeah. But yeah. In a way, there's a stream dedicated to crafting and gathering. There's some heavy story there, though, I'm sure. What I like about it is that the whole crystalline mean situation is all divided into like 5 separate areas, each which have 1 to 3 or more or fewer crafting professions under its umbrella. It's very similar to what the role quests do for the jobs, for the combat classes, but also very similar to that. Those storylines all converge, and you get a nice payoff of all of them converging in a great way, which I just injected in my veins. I love that storytelling. I've said it like a broken record. I will not stop saying it. This record will remain broken. I will remain broken. I will remain maniacal like that. You know, all the stories converge in a great payoff if you do all of them. We want to do all of them and then see the payoff. Maybe one stream is a bit too ambitious for that. Maybe later in April or even, well, hopefully not all the way until May, we start 5.1 and things like that. And even through all this, Stormblood has pending things, but again, why I need to do some playlists for Stormblood Shadowbringers at least. When you separate them like that, it helps. Anything earlier than that, a lot of it is lost. There's no archives for it, unfortunately. Twitch Vaults got lost for that. It couldn't even transfer them to Tajigen archives. So there's a lot of issue with that. But otherwise, yeah. At the very least, I can begin doing the Shadowbringers playlist. Maybe one day we'll do a lot of these in New Game Plus. I'm very obsessed with doing a lot of the Ally Societies on stream. Not the daily quests, but the ones that come in between reputations, because there's no New Game Plus for them. So my one chance at documenting it, the Khaiden Tajigen experience of that, you know, can only be done once, unless I go crazy replaying with another character or something. Something like that, and I don't know if I want to go that far. But anyway, that's the long and long, not the long and short, the long and long of what's coming up in FF14. Legend CA, as I said, Mega Dimension, hopefully finish soon as well. After that is done, Pokemon Violet has some pending business. I also have some off-stream work to do regarding that with the Blueberry quests, some group quests, because the pending business mostly talks about those legendary Pokemon from past generations that you can catch. We'll just pursue them all. Hell, we may do those group Blueberry quests on the stream also, for all I know. So we'll see. We'll see if it's done like that. If it's done like that, I feel like I should do them to your service as well. Like, I need about 5 or 6 of them maybe left. I don't remember. We would do more than those for your benefit, you know, the Tajigen, for the Superstar Squad's benefit. But yeah. So the idea would be that it rotates, depending on how many are interested in joining and all that. So yeah, that has potential. So it may be that too. And then a Pokemon Violet stream after that is like for other things. There may still be stuff in Legend CA, it's just not gonna be story-based. So things may be different there. Things may be different indeed. After that pending business is done in Pokemon Violet, Pokemon Champions might be out by then, so we may check it out, but otherwise, we're gonna move on. Story Saturday continues to be called Story Saturday in many ways. We're gonna move on to a new, completely different RPG. Well, not new, it didn't come out recently or something. The one I'm thinking about. It may be another one though, it may not be that, I need to do some tests maybe. See the PC requirements again, because the PC has been showing its age a lot as of late, I think. So yeah. Yeah. That's the long and long, not the long and short, the long and long of the things coming up. Usually I don't go into this much detail, but there's some specific plans. Almost the entirety of April mapped out in that way. Not so bad to map out an entire month. Just, you know, keep in mind having some flexibility to be able to adapt to changes, unexpected changes and all that. They definitely happen, both good and bad. I'm very good at making plans. Following through with them is another story. Though for the stream, I generally am able to stick to the plans. If anything changes the plans, it's not me not sticking to them, because I'm ADHD going brrr and all that. I mean, it still goes brrr, but not as badly as it does in other aspects of my life compared to the stream. But no, if the changes in plan happen, it's because of scuff preventing something, right? But even through the scuff that happened this week, we've been able to do great things. Yeah, 2 out of the 4 streams this week had like something that just messed up with the stream. The power outage situation yesterday, cutting it short. We were about to end it, so I just ended it in an abrupt way. It's kind of funny. I have the pinned comment again on the VOD on YouTube for that, so that you understand why it ended like that. Hopefully it's visible enough, I don't know. And it all will be part of the Legend CA playlist. If it happens for the last Legend CA stream, I'm probably gonna allow the VOD to be split so I can at least say some closing words for that and all that. I don't know. But yeah. What was I saying? And then, of course, 14 had an issue with the PC. Everything froze. There was an awful BSOD without the BSOD itself. That's how I call it. But yeah. Anyway, it's been a lovely week. We'll end the stream right here. No raid on Twitch. On the Twitch side of things, obviously we couldn't raid yesterday with the way it abruptly ended. I probably would have raided. I think it was my plan to do it, but not today. We ended just like this. Alright? I hope to see you for another week of amazing things this coming week, because... great denouement already in Legend CA. We did finish the main story in Mega Dimension. I forgot to mention that too, right? Yesterday, we finished a lot of things in FF14, truly transitioned into another era. We transition from winter to spring, from summer to fall, depending on your hemisphere on Earth. Maybe you're watching this from Venus or Neptune like the humanities we saw during last and First Man, for all I know. Who knows if you're even in a dimension where Earth is the main planet for humanity, for all I know. Watching from Middle Earth on the Palantir? Yeah. Hello to you, Tajigen, in the Palantir. Hello, Saruman. Are you like the Saruman from an alternate timeline that didn't go bad? Yeah, Saruman the many-colored, but the good version. Wish they would have had that in the movie. I can see why they didn't, though, with everything they were doing. Would have been an extra detail that's hard to elaborate on and kind of random, maybe. I digress. Thanks so much for a fantastic week, Tajigen. This next one may have the... if it goes as planned again, Last and First Man's live reading ends, and you're gonna see just the full weight of just how heavy, in a good way, I don't mean in a bad way necessarily, how amazing this book overall is, if you can even call it a novel. And also perhaps even some denouement in Legend CA, maybe the last stream or the second to last stream. If anything, the stream after that, maybe extra things like just online battles or something. Who knows? It will at least be out for a week, because again, special week with like a couple karaoke streams, collab stream, things like that. Yeah, because the Saturday in between the Kamen Rider karaoke and the Super Sentai karaoke, which are Friday and Sunday respectively, I'm not sure what I want to do. I wish I could do something like a Metal Heroes karaoke, even if it's not an anniversary for it, because it would fit nicely, but I don't know if I know enough Metal Heroes songs, you know? I only really know the first 3 openings of the Space Sheriff trilogy, so I'm thinking maybe just a general karaoke that includes those, I don't know. And of course, trying my best to keep my voice well, I don't know. Something Tokusatsu related would be good for the karaoke, but I'm struggling to think of other things. We'll figure something out, maybe. Or maybe just general Toku with still Sentai and Rider songs, but others that weren't in. I'm gonna be able to make it to the other karaoke stream. I don't know. Anyway, before I just over-yap, let's end the stream right here. Again, last and first man next week ending, maybe Legend CA as well, and some major things in FF14. And stay tuned whether, well, I don't know what's gonna happen on Thursday. Maybe a full stream, maybe not. I don't think it should be bilateral again. Actually, the TCG Thursday thing, that little alliteration I want to go for. Yeah, TCG Tuesday would make it sound even better, because it's a solid T for both of them. But still, Thursday is the day that's best for me. Doesn't work for me right now to have it split like that, Tuesday and then Thursday to Sunday. But anyway, stay tuned for that. I may go for a TCG, probably Master Duel again. I still need to do Magic the Gathering Arena eventually. But alright. Thank you for watching, Tajigen, and for giving us your support in whichever way you did this week. Any you do is appreciated. Hey, like and subscribe on YouTube. Consider following on Twitch. Subscribing even to give me your money. My Throne wishlist right there in the lower left corner. I had a Pocopia on the Switch too, though that was for a giveaway. But yeah, they have crowdfunding and everything. I may do more with the Throne wishlist as well. But anyway, before I overyap, arigato minna, otsukare-sama deshita.